He slammed the papers down so hard the ink still hadn't dried when Clara's hands started shaking. Orson Vane didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was the worst part. He stood in the doorway of the house that had been her home for 9 years, smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows he's won, and said, "Sign them. Or I'll make sure a judge decides you're not fit to raise those girls anyway." Tessa was 7 years old and standing right behind Clara's leg. She heard every word. Maisie was 4. She didn't understand the papers, but she understood the way her mother's body went still, the way animals go still before something terrible happens. That night, Clara made a decision that would either save her daughters or destroy them all. Before we go any further, if you've ever had to choose between safety and security, between running sheen and staying, between a lie that protects and a truth that destroys, this story is going to stay with you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one, raw, real, and human down to the bone. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1883. The advertisement had been a gamble. Clara knew that. She had known it the moment she read it, sitting at the kitchen table with a candle burned halfway down, and both girls asleep in the next room. Their breathing the only sound she trusted anymore in that house. Rancher, widower, 38, Wyoming Territory. Seeking capable woman for household management. References preferred. Reply to Box 14, Cheyenne Dispatch. That was it. No flowery language, no promises of romance or a beautiful life. Just a man who needed help and said so plainly. Clara had read 100 of these advertisements over the years her neighbor misses. Potts collected newspapers like other women collected recipes, and most of them were embarrassing in their desperation or suspicious in their vagueness. This one felt different. It felt like a door left open by accident, rather than one propped open on purpose to lure someone in. She wrote back the same night, and she lied. Not about everything. She told him she was a widow, which was technically true. Henry Whitlock had died of a lung infection 8 months earlier, and she had grieved him genuinely, even knowing the marriage had become more obligation than love in its final years. She told him she was capable, which was absolutely true. She could cook, preserve, sew, doctor minor injuries, manage accounts, and work from sunup to past sundown without complaint. She told him she was experienced with frontier conditions, which was mostly true. Her grandmother had kept a small homestead in eastern Kansas until Clara was 12, and those years had left their mark. What she did not tell Gideon Rusk was that she had 2 daughters. She told herself it was because the advertisement said woman, not family. She told herself it was practical. She would explain in person, where a man could see the children were quiet and self-sufficient, not a burden. She told herself she wasn't really lying, only omitting. But she knew, sitting there with the candle guttering in the draft from the poorly sealed window, that she was lying because she was afraid. And she was afraid because Orson had told her exactly what would happen if she tried to leave Buchanan County without his permission. Orson Vane was not her husband. He was Henry's younger brother, 34 years old, unmarried, and convinced that the death of his brother had transferred some form of authority over Clara and the girls directly to him. The law was ambiguous enough on that point, particularly regarding a widow's access to her late husband's property, particularly when that widow's father-in-law had left the estate to both sons, without specifying what happened if one of them died, that Orson had decided ambiguity was as good as ownership. He had started small. A visit, then 2, then nearly every day. Suggestions about how the house should be managed. Questions about where Clara was spending money and whether she was spending it wisely. An offer delivered with that smile that never reached his eyes to manage the estate on her behalf, so she wouldn't have to worry herself. Clara had declined politely. Orson had stopped being polite. By the time the papers appeared documents he claimed established his guardianship rights over Tessa and Maisie, Clara had stopped sleeping through the night. She had started locking every door. She had started watching Tessa learn to read the room the same way Clara did, that careful, constant assessment of whether a person's body language matched their words. A 7-year-old should not know how to do that. The knowledge of it made Clara feel something she rarely let herself feel: rage, pure and clarifying as winter water. She wrote to Gideon Rusk and she omitted her daughters, and she told herself she would fix the lie when she arrived. The truth was simpler than any of her rationalizations. She was buying herself time. She needed to get out of Missouri. She needed to get somewhere Orson couldn't walk through the front door whenever he pleased. If she told a rancher in Wyoming territory that she was bringing 2 children, he might say no. If she arrived with 2 children and gave the man a choice, standing in front of them, well, most men were different up close. Most men couldn't look at a 4-year-old with blue eyes and say, "Go back where you came from." That was the gamble, that the man would be decent enough, up close, to make the right choice. It was not a comfortable gamble to have made. Clara thought about it the entire journey west on the train through Kansas City, on the second train through Denver, and on the stagecoach that carried them north into Wyoming territory through weather that turned hostile without warning. She thought about it when the driver died. She was still thinking about it when she realized the horses were stopping. The storm had been building for hours before it became something genuinely dangerous. Clara had watched the sky darken through the stagecoach window with the unease of someone who had spent enough time outdoors to respect that particular shade of gray, the flat, pressurized gray that meant the temperature was still dropping and the wind was still deciding how serious it intended to be. There were 3 others dark. There were 3 other passengers. An older cattle merchant named Burley, who was most of the journey with his hat over his face, a young land surveyor who kept trying to make conversation until Tessa gave him the flat look she had apparently inherited directly from Clara, and a woman of about 50 named Hester, who had boarded in Laramie and spent the first hour studying Clara's daughters with open curiosity, before apparently deciding they were none of her business. When the storm hit properly, it hit fast. Clara had been half dozing with Maisie against her side, the 4-year-old's small weight warm and trusting, when the coach lurched and then slowed and then stopped entirely. The driver shouted something that was torn apart by the wind before it reached them. Then there was a sound, not a crash, more of a heavy collapse, something large simply ceasing to resist, and after that, silence that felt worse than the sound. Burley woke up. The surveyor opened the door and immediately closed it again. The wind was already screaming. "Driver's down," he said, and his voice had the flattened quality of someone managing panic by refusing to acknowledge it. "I don't know, he's not moving," Hester said calmly, that they needed to get off the road and find shelter. Clara was already looking out the window. She could barely see anything. Snow moved sideways, thick and purposeful, the way blizzards moved when they weren't planning to stop for a while. But there was a suggestion of light, distant and wavering, the kind of light that meant a window rather than a lantern, which meant a building rather than another stranded traveler. "There," she said. Nobody argued. There was nothing to argue with. A possible shelter in a storm this severe was not a suggestion to debate. Burley pulled on his coat, and Hester wrapped herself in the wool blanket she'd apparently had the foresight to bring, and the servers helped the horses as best he could, and Clara picked up Maisie. Child had gone quiet in a way that frightened her. Not sleep quiet, something more withdrawn. In the weeks since they'd left Missouri, Maisie had been gradually retreating into herself, fewer words each day, longer silences, a way of watching the world distance that wasn't the world from a slight distance, that wasn't in a 4-year-old, and that Clara had been telling herself was temporary, was just adjustment, was something that would resolve when they were settled somewhere safe. Walking through that snow, Maisie's face pressed against her shoulder, the child's breath coming in shallow intervals that were too far apart, Clara stopped lying to herself about it. Something was wrong. Not just frightened, something was wrong with her daughter, had been wrong weeks, and Clara had been too busy surviving to look at it directly. "Mama." That was Tessa right at her side, one hand gripping Clara's coat. 7 years old, and already the steadiness in her voice was not a child's steadiness. It was the steadiness of someone who had decided that falling apart was not something she could afford. "Mama, I can see it better now, the light. It's a house." "I know, sweetheart." Maisie's cold. "I know. How much further?" Clara did not know. She kept walking. Gideon Rusk heard them before he saw them. He had been in the barn when the storm turned serious, checking on the horses with the automatic attention of a man who had spent 20 years learning that the animal's comfort was directly related to his own survival. He stayed longer than he needed to, not because there was more work, but because the barn was easier than the house. The barn had a specific smell and a specific weight of air and a set of sounds that were exactly what they should be. The house, 14 months after Margaret's death, still had the wrong kind of quiet in it, the kind that pressed. He was pulling his coat tighter and preparing to make the run back to the house when he heard something that wasn't the storm. He stood in the barn doorway and listened. Voices. More than one. One of them was a child's. The logic of what he did next was simple. He went toward the sound. He hadn't thought about it, wouldn't have been able to explain it if someone asked. A child's voice in a blizzard was not a thing you stood still about. He found them about 40 yards from his front porch, 5 people stumbling through snow that was already past their knees. And one of them was a woman carrying a small child, and the child was not moving the way children move when they're just tired or cold or unhappy. He met them in the dark, and the noise and the snow, and he got them inside. And it was only when he had the woman by the lamplight with the child in her arms that he saw the blue in the little girl's lips. Everything else could wait. He threw open the door and said, "Get to the fire. Now." Clara would remember the next hour, in fragments for the rest of her life. Not in sequence. Not clearly. Memory doesn't work that way. When your body is running on fear and cold and the specific adrenaline of watching your child not respond the way she should. She remembered the fire, big and generous, filling most of one wall, which told her something about the man, even before she looked at him properly, that he kept a real fire, not the skinflint kind that men who lived alone often kept, just enough to take the edge off the cold, rather than genuinely fighting it. She remembered Tessa standing in the corner with her back to the wall, watching the strange man with absolute concentration. Not scared, Tessa had moved past, scared into something older and more careful. Assessment. Study. Her daughter was watching Gideon Rusk, the way a person watches something they haven't decided about yet. She remembered Hester taking charge of the kettle without being asked, and Burley sitting heavily in a chair and not getting up again. Most of its windows were dark, and the surveyor standing uselessly in the doorway until Gideon told him quietly that the horses needed water, and if he wanted to make himself helpful, there was a task. Mostly she remembered Maisie, stripping the wet outer layers off her daughter, while Gideon brought another blanket without being asked. Pressing her hands against Maisie's cheeks and her neck, and watching for the color to come back. Talking to her, Maisie, "Sweetheart, you're warm now. You're safe. Look at Mama," with a steadiness in her voice that she did not feel anywhere in her body. And slowly, the blue left Maisie's lips, and the color came back. And Maisie opened her eyes and looked at Clara and didn't say anything, but she put her hand against Clara's face. Just rested it there. The way she used to do when she was very small and couldn't sleep and just needed to know Clara was real. Clara had to press her lips together very hard for a moment. She turned to look at Gideon Rusk for the first time since they'd come inside. He was standing a careful distance away, giving them space that she hadn't asked for but immediately recognized as deliberate. He was a tall man, broad in the way that came from work rather than size, with a face that looked like it had spent most of its years outdoors and hadn't bothered being pretty about it. He looked weathered. Not old, not much past 40, she would learn later, but worn in a specific way that she recognized because she had spent 9 months watching it in her own mirror. It was the worn look of recent loss that hadn't finished settling yet. He was looking at Maisie with an expression that Clara could not entirely read. Not resentment that would have been easier to manage. Something more complicated. Something that looked briefly and involuntarily like pain. She would think about that later. Right now, she said, "Thank you. She's going to be all right, I think." He nodded. "She needs to stay warm, I know. There's a bedroom. Off the back hall, it locks." Clara's throat tightened. She had not said a word about the lock. She had not indicated in any way that a locking door was something she valued. And yet he had mentioned it first, before anything else, in the same flat, practical tone as she needs to stay warm. She looked at him more carefully. He met her eyes and didn't look away. "I need to tell you something," Clara said. "I know," Gideon said. "You've got 2 daughters." She stared at him. "The advertisement said 1 woman," he said. "You've got 2 girls with you, so." He paused. Looked at Maisie, who had closed her eyes again but was breathing steadily. Looked at Tessa, who was still watching him from the corner with that careful 7-year-old intensity. "So I figured you had reasons." Clara said, You're not angry. I'm something, he said. Hasn't decided what yet. He moved toward the kitchen. Are you hungry? The girls hungry? Yes, Tessa said, from her corner before Clara could answer. Gideon glanced at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of where one might eventually go. Good, he said. There's stew. Later, much later, after the other travelers had been settled as best as the house could manage, and after Maisie had eaten 3 spoonfuls of stew and fallen asleep with the blanket tucked to her chin, and after Tessa had eaten considerably more than 3 spoonfuls while maintaining continuous surveillance of every adult in the room, Clara found Gideon in the kitchen. She had given Tessa very specific instructions about the bedroom door and made sure she understood them. Most of its windows were dark. Then she'd come to find the man who had opened his door in a blizzard and not asked a single question about why a woman who had written him a letter about herself had arrived with 2 children who hadn't been mentioned. He was washing the stew pot. His back was to her. He knew she was there. She had heard his hands stop moving for a second when she came in, but he didn't turn around. They're mine, Clara said. Both of them. In case that needed saying. Didn't. Tessa is 7. Maisie is 4. She paused. I didn't put them in the letter because I was afraid you'd say no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned around and his face was doing that complicated thing again. The thing she hadn't been able to read earlier. Up close, it was slightly easier. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't entirely settled either. Were you afraid I'd say no to you? He said. Or to them? Clara looked at him. To them, she said finally. He nodded. Once. Turned back to the pot. The room locks from the inside, he said. Keys on the door. I'll sleep out here until we figure out what makes sense. He said it the way a person says obvious something mildly inconvenient, like a loose fence board that needs fixing, not like a concession or a gesture. Clara stood in his kitchen, in a house she had arrived at by accident, in the middle of a blizzard, listening to a man she had never met arrange his own discomfort with complete matter-of-factness, and she felt something she hadn't felt. In so long she almost didn't recognize it. Safe. Not comfortable safe. The distinction mattered. She had been comfortable in Missouri, technically. She had had a house and a stove and neighbors and a life that looked fine from the outside. She had not felt safe in over a year. She stood in Gideon Rusk's kitchen and breathed quietly and let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put it away, because safety had to be earned, and she had done nothing yet to earn it, and she was not a woman who accepted gifts she hadn't worked for. I want 1 winter, she said. He looked at her. To prove it's worth the trouble. 1 winter. If it's not working, I'll find somewhere else in the spring. She paused. But I won't leave without them. They go where I go. That's not a negotiation. Gideon set the clean pot on the shelf. Nobody's asking you to negotiate that, he said. She went to bed. She locked the door. She lay in the dark listening to her daughters breathe. Tessa's slow and deliberate. Maisie's still slightly uneven. And she thought about the expression on Gideon Rusk's face when he'd seen the color coming back into Maisie's lips. She thought about what it looked like when a man recognized something in someone else's pain. The involuntary flinch of it. The way it came from somewhere real. She would ask him about it later. For now, she let herself sleep. It was the first full night of sleep she'd had in 4 months. The morning after the blizzard, Gideon Rusk woke up on his own kitchen floor with a saddle blanket across his legs and a crick in his neck that would take 3 days to work out, and the first thing he heard was someone in his kitchen who was not him. He lay still for a moment, listening. Not out of suspicion, out of the specific disorientation of a man who had spent 14 months waking up to absolute silence and had forgotten what it sounded like when a house had people in it. There were small sounds. A pot being moved carefully, the deliberate quiet of someone trying not to wake others. The scrape of the iron door on the stove being opened. Tick and catch of a fire being encouraged from last night's coals. He got up. Clara was standing at his stove in the gray early light, still in yesterday's clothes, her hair pinned back with what appeared to be 2 forks, because she hadn't yet located whatever she normally used. She was coaxing the fire up with the focused expression of someone performing a task they had done 10,000 times. She did not look up when he came in, which he appreciated. He wasn't entirely presentable, and he didn't have the energy to pretend the previous night hadn't happened. Coffee's not ready yet, she said. Give it 10 minutes. You didn't have to. The girls are still sleeping. She moved the pot to the back of the stove. I needed something to do. He understood that. The need to be useful when you didn't know what else to be. He'd spent the first 6 months after Margaret died, fixing things that didn't need fixing, fence posts that were perfectly stable, hinges that worked fine, a stretch of roof that had years left in it. His hands had needed a purpose when his head couldn't provide one. He sat down at the kitchen table and watched her work, and she let him, and they didn't speak for a few minutes, and it wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised him. Most silence, in his experience, was either comfortable or not, and you knew which kind it was within about 30 seconds. This one was neither. It was provisional. Two people being careful with each other, taking up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. The other people, he said, from the coach. Still sleeping, far as I can tell. Burley snores. She glanced at him. The surveyor was up at first light. I think he left. Gideon nodded. He'd have to deal with the stagecoach itself when the weather cleared the driver, the horses, whatever remained. That was a cold thought, and he set it aside for now. Hester, Clara said, the older woman. She'll need to get to Cheyenne. She has family. Roads will be clear in 2-3 days if it stays dry. I told her that. He looked at her. She had apparently spent the early morning hours taking inventory of everyone's situation and communicating relevant information. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. It was his house, and then he looked at her face more carefully and understood that she wasn't managing his household. She was managing her own anxiety, giving herself things to solve, because things you could solve were easier than things you couldn't. Coffee, she said, and set a cup in front of him. It was strong, stronger than he made it himself, which he hadn't thought was possible. He drank it and said nothing about that, and she sat down across from him with her own cup and finally looked at him properly for the first time since the previous night. She looked, he thought, like someone who had slept but not rested. The difference was visible in the set of her eyes. The surface of her was composed and functional and had clearly decided to be that way. But underneath it, something was still running very fast. I owe you a more complete explanation, she said. You don't owe me anything yet. I lied in my letter. You omitted in your letter, he said. There's a difference, depending on why you did it. She studied him. He got the sense she was deciding whether to take the opening he'd offered or push past it toward something harder. After a moment, she pushed past it. My husband's brother has been trying to take my girls, she said. Legally, he has lawyers, and I had a house that wasn't fully mine, and a county where everybody knew his family longer than they knew me. She wrapped her hands around the cup. He told me if I tried to leave, he'd file papers claiming I was unstable, unfit, that the girls would be better off in a household with a male authority. The word authority came out with a dryness that wasn't quite contempt, but was close to it. He was probably right that a judge in Buchanan County would have listened to him. Gideon was quiet for a moment. So you left. So I left. She paused, without telling him, which is why I needed to get to Wyoming before he figured out where I'd gone. Which is why I couldn't afford to write an honest letter and wait for an honest reply. Which is why she met his eyes. I am sitting at your table, apologizing for something I would do again. He didn't say anything right away. He thought about the blue around the little girl's lips. He thought about the older one, standing in the corner with that flat, watchful look. He thought about a woman who had walked through a blizzard, rather than stay somewhere she didn't feel safe. You know where you are now? He said. Not yet. Eventually he'll figure it out, probably. I was careful, but I wasn't invisible. She set her cup down. I don't want to bring trouble to your door. I want you to know that. If it becomes a problem, I'll find another arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I don't know yet. He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind was still going, not the full-throated violence of last night, but the quieter persistence of a storm deciding whether it was finished. In the bedroom down the hall, one of the girls made a sound, not distress, just the sound of someone shifting in their sleep, and Clara's eyes went to the hallway and came back. Your girls got names, he said. Something in her face changed, not softened exactly. Unlocked. Tessa, she said. The older one, and Maisie. Maisie's the one who… Yes. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She do that often? Go quiet like that? Clara was still for a moment. She didn't used to, she said, finally. She used to talk constantly. You couldn't get her to stop. She had opinions about everything. about what color the sky was and whether her shoes were in a good mood and why birds sat on fence posts. Something moved behind her eyes and she looked down at her cup. Stopped, mostly about 4 months ago. Gideon didn't ask what had happened 4 months ago. He could do that math himself. She'll be all right, Clara said. She just needs time and quiet and to feel like things aren't. She stopped. Started again. She needs to feel like things aren't about to fall apart again. He understood that too, more than he wanted to. He drank his coffee. 1 winter, he said. That's what I asked for. Then let's see what a winter looks like. He stood up, set his cup on the counter. I'll start on the chores. You can do whatever you need to do. For the girls. He pulled on his coat. There's flour in the second bin. Honey in the cellar if you want it. Clara looked at him. Gideon, she said. He stopped. Why did you mention the lock first? Last night. Before anything else. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the door rather than at her. Margaret asked me for one, he said, on the spare room, before we were married. Said she needed to know she could. He paused. I didn't understand it at the time. Thought it was odd. I understand it better now. He went out to the barn. Clara sat at his table in the early gray light and listened to the wind and thought that she had expected many things from this gamble, but not that. Not the particular kind of understanding that came from someone who had learned something by loss. She got up and started making breakfast. The other travelers left within 3 days, Hester last, with a long look at Clara and the girls and a quiet word for Gideon that Clara couldn't hear. The roads north were passable, barely. The stage company sent 2 men with a cart for what remained of the coach and the driver, and Gideon dealt with that quietly and didn't describe it in any detail, which Clara appreciated. And then there were 4 of them, and the ranch and the Wyoming winter settling in, for real. The first week was awkward in the way that any shared space between strangers is awkward, not hostile. Just careful. Lots of moving around each other in corridors. Lots of brief, practical conversations about the stove temperature and the water and where things were kept. Gideon had a rhythm to his days that was deeply ingrained. The rhythm of a man who had been managing alone for over a year, and Clara moved around it rather than through it, learning the shape of his routine, the way you learn the shape of a new kitchen where the light was good. The door swung, what angle which floorboards made noise. Tessa, for her part, made no secret of the fact that she was watching all of this. She was, Clara reflected, an exhausting child in the very best way. Not difficult, Tessa had been genuinely easy for most of her life, self-sufficient and straightforward, and possessed of a dry practicality that had always made Clara feel like she was raising a very small, very opinionated adult. But the last year had sharpened something in her. Tessa had decided, at some point, that the appropriate response to uncertainty was vigilance, and she had dedicated herself to it the way she dedicated herself to everything, completely. She watched Gideon the way a scientist watches a sample, cataloged his behavior, made the note, apparently, of every inconsistency between what he said and what he did. He said the girls could have the second blanket from the chest if they were cold. Tessa waited 2 days before she took it, watching to see if the offer changed. It didn't. He said there was a brown horse in the barn that was gentle and could be visited if they wanted. Tessa didn't visit, but she watched the barn from the kitchen window for a week to see how he treated the animals when he thought no one was paying attention. He was patient with them. Clara noticed that. Not performatively patient, not the kind of patience that expects to be noticed and thanked for itself, but the practical patience of a man who had decided on a course of action and didn't see the point of deviating from it. He didn't push for conversation. He didn't make large gestures. He didn't try to make Maisie smile, which was the thing that would have most immediately destroyed any trust she'd placed in him. Because Maisie was 4 years old and had already learned to distrust adults who tried too hard. One afternoon, it was the 9th or 10th day, Clara was fairly sure. She came in from checking on the root cellar inventory and found Gideon at the kitchen table with a piece of wood and a small knife, doing something careful and repetitive with both. He didn't acknowledge her. She started on the bread and didn't acknowledge him. They worked in their separate quiets for about 20 minutes before she glanced over and saw what he was making. It was a horse. Small, rough, the proportions slightly off, in the way handmade things often are, but recognizable. Unmistakably a horse, with a curved neck and 4 distinct legs and a tail that was more suggestion than reality. She didn't say anything about it. He finished it and set it on the table and stood up and went back outside. That evening, Clara left it on the floor near the fireplace, in a spot where Maisie would find it without it being presented to her, without anyone standing over it with expectations. Maisie found it the following morning and picked it up and turned it over in her hands for a long time. She didn't say anything. She put it in her pocket and carried it for 3 weeks before she lost it, and then she cried about it quietly by herself in the bedroom until Clara found her, and that was the most Maisie had cried over anything since they'd left Missouri, which meant something, though Clara wasn't sure exactly what yet. The ranch needed work. That was an understatement of the kind that only became apparent by degrees every day. Clara found something else that had been let go, not from negligence exactly, but from the particular entropy of a man managing alone with no energy for anything beyond the essential. Pantry was poorly organized, supplies duplicated in some areas and absent in others. 2 windows were drafting cold air from seals that had dried out and cracked. The main bedroom, Gideon's room, which she never entered, had a door that didn't close properly, which meant the hallway was always colder than it should have been. There were clothes that needed mending, blankets that needed washing, at least one wall in the back room where something had gotten in and left evidence of itself in the insulation. Clara worked. She worked the way she always worked, not frantically, not with any display, just steadily, the way a river moves, continuously, and without drama and without stopping. She started on the pantry first because it was visible and finite, and she needed to understand what they actually had before she could plan anything. Then the windows, then the clothing. She was 3 weeks in before she got to the back room, and by then she had developed enough of a pattern that Gideon had stopped looking mildly startled when he came indoors and found something had changed. He didn't thank her for it directly, but she noticed the way he moved through the pantry now, no longer having to look for things, and she noticed that he mentioned one evening, without preamble, that the main room was warmer. He said it the same way. He said everything plainly, as a fact, without particular weight. She received it the same way. They were, she realized, both people who found the carrying of debts uncomfortable, who preferred the clean simplicity of equivalency. That made things easier. What made things harder was Tessa. Not because Tessa was doing anything wrong. She wasn't. She was, if anything, almost uncannily well-behaved. She did what she was asked without complaint. She helped with Maisie without being told. She kept herself occupied with the books Clara had brought and with watching the weather and with the serious business of learning the routine of the ranch. She was, by any external measure, a model child. The problem was that she was a 7-year-old who was working very hard at not being a 7-year-old, and Clara could see the effort it cost her, even if Tessa would never admit it. One evening, Clara found her outside the barn in the cold, standing with her arms crossed and her jaw set, staring at nothing in particular with an expression that Clara recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror approximately 800 times in the past year. "Tessa, I'm fine, I didn't ask." Tessa was quiet. "You can go inside. You don't have to stand watch." "I'm not standing watch." "Then what are you doing?" A long pause. The wind moved between them. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted. "I'm thinking," Tessa said finally. "About what?" Another pause. Tessa was not a child who answered questions carelessly. She considered them the way she considered everything seriously, with appropriate gravity, as if the wrong answer might have consequences. "About whether he's going to change," she said. Clara looked at her daughter. "People do," Tessa said. "Start out one way and then change." Her voice was flat and factual, the voice she used when she was saying something she had already decided was true. Uncle Orson started out different. Clara was quiet for a moment. Cold had gotten into her coat, but she didn't move. "That's true," she said. "Some people do. So how do you know?" "You don't?" "Not for certain." Tessa looked at her. "That's not very helpful, Mama." "No," Clara agreed. "It's not." She thought about what else to say. She could give her daughter the comfortable answer, "He seems kind. He's been patient. I think we can trust him." Tessa would see through the comfort to the uncertainty underneath it, and the dishonesty would cost Clara more than the uncertainty. "What I know is what I've seen so far. He does what he says he'll do. He doesn't make promises he can't keep. He doesn't try to make you like him." That last one could be a trick, Tessa said. It could be, Clara said. People who know what they're doing sometimes understand that not trying is more effective than trying. She paused. Or it could just be that he respects that trust takes time. Tessa thought about this for a long time. Which do you think it is? She said. Clara looked at the barn. At the lights still on inside, the faint sounds of Gideon moving around in there, doing whatever needed doing in the way he always did things quietly, without announcement, without expecting anyone to notice. I think I'm going to keep watching, she said. Same as you. Tessa considered this and appeared to find it an acceptable answer. She went inside. Clara stood in the cold a moment longer, and she thought about the lock on the bedroom door and what Gideon had said about Margaret, most windows, and the wooden horse that he'd left on the table, and walked away from without waiting to see what happened to it. She went inside too. It was in the 4th week that Gideon made the mistake. It was small. He knew it was small, knew it the moment it happened, but he could see from Tessa's face that small didn't matter. The consequence of a mistake was not proportional to its size. It was proportional to who was watching and what they were already primed to see. He had come in from morning chores cold, and out of sorts a fence had come down overnight. 2 posts snapped clean off by ice weight, and 3 steers had wandered through the gap into the north pasture, and it had taken him an hour and a half to locate and return them, and he had said, more shortly than he intended, that breakfast could wait because he needed to deal with the damn fence before the ground got any worse. Clara had said fine, practically. That was all just fine, and she turned back to the stove. But Tessa had been at the table. Tessa had heard the sharpness in his voice and seen her mother's back go straight, and still the same stillness Clara went into when she was absorbing something unpleasant and deciding not to react to it, and something had moved behind Tessa's. Eyes that made Gideon's stomach drop even as he was pulling his coat back on. He spent 2 hours on the fence thinking about that look. Not because Tessa had done anything, said anything, made any indication beyond a look. Because he knew what the look was. He had seen a version of it before, in the eyes of men who'd come back from the war with particular histories. The looks of someone whose body reacted to a sharp tone before their brain could assess whether the threat was real. She'd heard that tone somewhere before, from someone whose sharpness had not been followed by nothing the way his would be. He came back in for lunch. Clara was at the stove. Tessa was on the floor near the fireplace with Maisie, the 2 of them doing something, with a piece of string, Tessa demonstrating and Maisie watching with her solemn, concentrated attention. Gideon hung his coat up and went to the sink and washed the fence work off his hands, and stood there for a moment looking at the water. Then he said, not turning around Tessa, a pause. Yes, I was short this morning. That wasn't. That was the fence talking, not me. He paused. I don't do that. Be short with people who didn't cause the problem. When I do it, it's worth noting and it's worth saying I was wrong. Another pause. Longer, okay, Tessa said. He turned around. She was looking at him with that careful look, running whatever he'd just said through whatever internal process she used to assess the reliability of adult behavior. He waited. Did you fix the fence? She said, yes. All of it? All of it. She looked back at the string. Good, she said. And the way she said it quiet, not hostile, not warm, just the word felt like something that had been held very tightly, releasing just slightly, just a little. Clara was facing the stove, and he couldn't see her face. He sat down at the table and didn't say anything else about it. January settled in like a declaration. Wyoming winters in the territory were not polite about what they were. They arrived with intent and they stayed without apology. And the cold was the kind of cold that clarified things. You made decisions differently when going outside required real preparation. You were more deliberate about everything. The house became smaller and more real. Clara learned Gideon by inches. She learned that he slept badly not every night, but regularly, and when he did, she could hear him moving around in the main room at hours when the rest of the world was entirely still. She never went out. She figured he knew she heard him, and that her not going out was what he needed. She learned that he had an opinion about everything related to horses, and no opinions at all about what he ate, which made cooking for him simultaneously easy and slightly unsatisfying, because she was a woman who cared about whether food was good, and she liked to know that someone noticed. She learned that he had been married for 4 years before Margaret died, that the child had been born early and not survived even a day, and that Gideon had buried both of them in the same grave on the east side of the property and had not spoken of it, apparently, to anyone since the minister who'd presided over the service. She learned that last part not from him, but from a neighboring rancher named Aldous Crane, who came by in late January to check on the fence line they shared and stayed for coffee, and was the kind of man who filled silence with words, which meant Clara learned more about Gideon in 40 minutes than she'd learned in 3 weeks of living with him. She didn't tell Gideon she knew, but she thought about it. She thought about what it meant to have buried a child and a wife in the same ground, and then gone on living in the house where she wasn't anymore, because where else would you go? Because the ranch was the work, and the work was the thing that kept you moving forward, and moving forward was the only alternative to stopping, and stopping was not survivable. She understood that. She had not buried anyone. But she understood the particular work of continuing when everything that had given the continuing its point was gone. One evening it was well into February, the worst of the winter somewhere behind them, but not gone. She found Gideon standing at the window of the main room, looking out at nothing visible, because it was dark outside and dark inside enough that the window was mostly a mirror. He had a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He had the look of a man who'd gone somewhere in his own head and was aware of it, and not entirely inclined to come back. Stood in the doorway. He didn't move. "You go out there much," she said. East side, a long pause. He didn't turn around. "Not much," he said. "Some, you don't have to answer this." "I know." She waited. "It's easier in the summer," he said. "Everything's easier in the summer. Winter, the ground is." He stopped. "It's hard to walk out there and see it looking like nothing in particular. Just frozen ground." "Yes," she said. She didn't say "I understand" because that phrase had been used so many times by so many people who didn't that it had worn down to almost nothing. She just said yes. He turned from the window and looked at her. Really looked. The way he rarely did. She was a person he dealt with, practically, efficiently, at close range in a shared space, but he didn't often look at her, the way you looked at someone you were trying to read. She would have liked Maisie, he said. Margaret, she would have... He stopped again. She collected small things. Interesting rocks, buttons that had colors she liked. She kept them in a jar on the windowsill. Something moved in his face. Maisie would have been right up her alley. Clara felt the back of her throat do something she didn't intend. "Tell me something about her. Something specific. Not the hard part, something small." He looked at her. "She put too much salt in everything," he said after a moment. "Couldn't break her of it. Said food needed to taste like it meant it." Clara pressed her lips together, nodded. "She was right," she said. Something that was not quite a smile found his face. Not full, just the corner of it. Just a suggestion. "Yeah," he said. "She usually was." He set the cold coffee down. "I'll check the horses," he said. "Gideon." She said it before she'd decided to. Stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door." He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking not at her but at some middle point. "You'd have found somewhere else," he said. "Probably," she said. "But I'm glad it was here." He went out. Clara stood in the empty main room and looked at the window where his reflection had been, and she thought that she was beginning to understand the shape of him, not all of it, not nearly, but enough to see that it was more complicated and more specific than she had expected, and that complicated and specific was, in her experience, almost always a good sign. That was the night Maisie drew her first picture in Wyoming. She had found a piece of charcoal from the fireplace. Lord knew how. She was resourceful in ways that were occasionally terrifying for a 4-year-old, and a piece of paper that Clara had brought in her bag, and she had drawn 3 figures. Small figures, round-headed and approximate. Clara could tell which one was herself because it was the tallest, and which ones were Tessa and Maisie because they were smaller and standing close together. The 3 of them in a cluster, and separate from them, a distance away, a single figure. Maisie put her finger on the cluster and looked at Clara. "Us," she said. Her voice was so quiet Clara almost missed it. The word came out small and careful, like something she was testing to see if it still worked. Clara looked at the single figure, standing outside the cluster, outside whatever boundary the cluster defined. "Who's that?" she said carefully. Maisie looked at the drawing for a long time. She put her finger on the 4th figure and moved it in a small, uncertain circle, not pointing so much as indicating. not claiming so much as noting. She didn't say anything. She folded the paper and put it under her pillow. Clara sat beside her until she fell asleep and thought about what it meant that the fourth figure existed at all. That Maisie had drawn him there, outside the line but present in the picture, when she could have drawn just 3. She thought about that for a long time before she could sleep. The break came on a Thursday in late February when Tessa walked into the barn while Gideon was working. She had never done it before. She had watched from the kitchen window for weeks, had approached the barn door and stopped twice that Clara knew of, had stood in the yard looking at it with the expression she used for things she was deciding about. And then on a Thursday afternoon when Clara was doing the mending and Maisie was asleep, Tessa simply walked in. Gideon was working on a bridle that had been damaged when the ice-weighted fence came down. Careful, close work, leather work that required attention, and offered it in return. He heard her come in. He did not stop what he was doing. He did not look up. He let her come to it in her own time. Stood about 6 feet from him for what was probably 2 full minutes, long enough that most adults would have said something, would have asked what she wanted, or offered a tour, or done something to fill the space. Gideon let it be a long 2 minutes. He kept his hands moving on the bridle. "Are you fixing that?" Tessa said. "Trying to. Can it be fixed?" "Most things can. Whether it's worth fixing is the better question." He held the bridle up and examined a particular joint. "This one's worth it. Good leather doesn't come cheap out here." Tessa came closer. Not next to him, a few feet away, still well outside anything that felt territorial. But closer. "What happened to it?" "Ice. Fence came down, the horse tangled in it. Leather wasn't cut, just stressed. A few stitches, some conditioning, it'll be fine." She watched his hands for a while. "Mama fixes clothes like that," she said. "When they're not ripped, just worn." Same idea. Another silence. Not hostile. Just 2 people in a barn in February, with the wind outside doing what Wyoming wind did, and a task in progress, and the particular ease that can sometimes grow in shared spaces when neither person is trying to make something happen. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. First time she'd used his name directly. "If you decided you didn't want us here anymore," she said, "what would you do?" He held the bridle in his hands and looked at her steadily. She was looking back at him with absolute directness, the way children looked at you when they were asking the real question, and not the polite version of it. "I would tell your mother," he said, plainly, with enough time to make a plan. He paused. "I wouldn't make you leave in winter. I wouldn't take it out on you or your sister, but you'd make us leave. I'd tell your mother the arrangement wasn't working. What happened after that would be her decision." Tessa thought about this. "Uncle Orson never said what he was going to do," she said. "He just did it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the bridle. "That's how small men operate," he said. "They don't warn you, because warning you would give you a choice, and they need you not to have choices." Tessa stared at him. He kept working on the bridle and didn't say anything else about it. She stood there for another 10 minutes, watching him work. Then she left without another word. That evening she ate dinner and she was quiet, the way she was always quiet. But it was a different quality of quiet. Clara noticed it. She watched her daughter eat and thought about whatever had happened in that barn and recognized, with a feeling that was almost physical in its relief, that something had shifted. Not fixed, not resolved. Not the sudden flowering of trust that only happened in stories that didn't know how trust actually worked. Just a shift. A small repositioning, like a stone that had been wedged at an angle, settling a degree toward level. Tessa pushed back from the table when she was done, and picked up her plate and Maisie's plate both and carried them to the sink without being asked. Then she said, to no one in particular, directed at the room, "The brown horse. The one you said was gentle." She was looking at the middle of the table. "What's its name?" Gideon looked up from his plate. "Buttercup," he said. Tessa's face did something she didn't entirely control. A flicker of something, the start of a sound she didn't let out. "Terrible name for a horse," she said. "I know," Gideon said. "She came with it." And Tessa, for the first time since they had arrived in Wyoming, laughed. It was short and she covered it almost immediately, as if she'd been startled by the sound of herself. But it happened. Clara heard it and felt it move through her chest like warm water. Gideon picked up his fork and kept eating and did not make a single thing of it, did not look pleased with himself, did not remark on it. He just let it be what it was. Under the table, Maisie reached up and very quietly, very deliberately, put her small hand over Clara's. Clara turned her hand over and held it. Outside, the Wyoming wind had, for the first time in weeks, gone almost entirely still. Tessa's laugh lasted maybe 3 seconds. But Clara heard it in her sleep that night, and when she woke before dawn with the cold pressing against the window glass, it was still there, that sound sitting in her chest, like something she hadn't known she was missing until it came back. She lay still and listened to her daughters breathe and thought about what it meant that Tessa could laugh again. Not what it meant for the future, not what it meant about Gideon or the arrangement or any of it. Just what it meant right now, in the simple arithmetic of a 7-year-old who had spent months being careful and had, for 3 seconds, forgotten to be. It meant something was working. She didn't know what, exactly. She didn't trust herself to name it yet, but something was working. She got up before the house woke and started the stove and stood in the kitchen in the dark and let herself feel it without examining it to death. March came in the way. March came in Wyoming, not with any particular improvement in the weather, because winter in the territory didn't consult the calendar before deciding when to be finished, but with a change in the quality of the light. Something shifted in how the afternoon sat on the snow. The shadows went slightly less blue. It wasn't warmth yet. It was the memory of warmth, arriving ahead of the thing itself, the way a sound travels through a wall before the door opens. Clara noticed it and said nothing, because she had learned that naming good things too early was a reliable way to jinx them. What she did instead was take inventory. Not of the pantry this time, everything else. The ranch had come alive in small ways over the past 2 months, not dramatically, not in ways that anyone who hadn't been watching carefully would notice, but in ways that Clara had cataloged with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The main room was warmer because she'd resealed the windows. The pantry was organized in a way that actually made sense. There were 3 jars of preserves she'd put up from the root cellar stores and a repair to the back room wall that had taken her 4 days and most of a bolt of burlap and was not pretty, but was effective. Clothing situation was better. The floors were cleaner. And underneath all of that, something harder to measure, the house felt occupied. Not just lived in, but occupied. The way a house felt when the people inside it had stopped being strangers to each other and started being something else. She wasn't sure what to call the something else. She wasn't going to try yet. What she did know was that Gideon had started coming to the table for the evening meal without needing to be called. For the first 6 weeks, she'd had to knock on the barn wall or the workshop door to let him know it was ready, not because he forgot. She understood, but because he'd been eating alone for 14 months, and the habit of it was deep, the habit of not planning your time around another person's schedule. Somewhere in February, he'd started showing up on his own, 5 minutes early sometimes. Clara had not remarked on it. She'd started leaving coffee on the stove in the mornings. He'd started leaving the water barrel filled before she got to it. Neither of them mentioned any of this. What they mentioned was practical things. The fence, the cattle count, the condition of the north pasture, whether the seed order needed to go to Cheyenne before the thaw made the roads unreliable in the other direction. These conversations happened over the table, or in passing, or some just standing in separate parts of the main room doing separate things, and they were efficient and low drama, and Clara found them in the quietest and most private part of herself, genuinely pleasant, not thrilling, not charged with anything she was going to examine, just pleasant, the way it was pleasant to have a mechanism that worked, to have gears that turned without grinding. She did not let herself think beyond that. She had enough to think about. Maisie's drawings had become a kind of record. She went through paper at a rate that Clara found both endearing and mildly alarming. She was 4 years old, and she drew with the seriousness of someone producing testaments, bent over the paper with her tongue between her teeth, the charcoal moving in careful, deliberate lines that didn't look like a child's marks at all. They looked like someone trying to get something right. Pictures had evolved since that first one, since the 3 figures clustered together with the 4th standing separate and outside. The 4th figure had moved closer, not inside the cluster, still distinct, still a single figure with space around him, but measurably closer. Clara had kept every drawing, folded carefully in the bottom of her bag, and she had looked at them in sequence one evening, when the girls were asleep, laid them out on the bed in order, and it was as clear as a map. The fourth figure in the earliest drawings was almost off the edge of the paper. By the middle of February, he was roughly equidistant between the edge and the cluster. By the end of the month, there was a line. Just a thin charcoal line, not emphatic, not bold. A suggestion. Connecting the fourth figure to the three. Clara had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at that line for a long time. She had not told Gideon about the drawings. She didn't know why exactly. It felt private, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, not secret, not something she was hiding with intent, just something that belonged to a space she hadn't yet figured out how to translate into words. She thought about Margaret's rock collection, the jar on the windowsill. She thought about the way Gideon had said she usually was with that incomplete, almost smile, and the way it had moved in his face like something returning from a long distance. She folded the drawings back up and put them in her bag. The trouble with Aldous Crane's announced itself on the second Saturday of March. Crane was not a bad man. Clara had figured that out by the second visit. He was talkative and nosy, in the way of people who lived too far from others and had lost any calibration for how much talking was appropriate in a given situation. But his nosiness was benign. He was curious about people, the way some people were curious about weather, as a force of nature, as something to be observed and commented on, with no particular agenda. But benign curiosity was still curiosity, and benign talking was still talking, and Aldous Crane had a wife named Dorothea who had not yet come to visit, but whose presence in the conversation was regular and significant. Gideon told her about Dorothea on a morning when Crane's wagon had just disappeared down the road, and Clara had asked, with studied casualness, what Crane's wife was like. She runs the social calendar for 3 ranches and the church auxiliary, and she'd run the territory if they'd let her, Gideon said. He was not saying it with contempt. He was saying it as a plain fact about a force of nature. She's not unkind. She's just thorough. Thorough how? He looked at her. She'll want to know who you are, he said. What you are. Where you came from. Why you're here. He paused. She'll find out whether you tell her or not. It's easier to tell her. Clara thought about that. What have you told Crane? She said. That you're a capable woman who needed work and I needed help. He picked up his coffee. That's the truth. It's not all of it. No, he said. But it's enough for now. It was enough for now. It was not, Clara knew, going to be enough for later. A woman living on a widower's ranch in the Wyoming Territory in Weinz 883 was a specific situation with specific social textures. And ignoring those textures didn't make them go away. She had grown up in a world where a woman's reputation was a practical object. Like a tool, it could be well maintained or poorly maintained. It could be lost or damaged or repaired, and its condition had direct material consequences. She had managed hers carefully for most of her adult life, and she had no illusions about the cost of letting it slip. What she was not prepared for was Dorothea Crane coming to the ranch 3 days later, without Aldous, on a morning when Clara was hanging laundry in the thin, cold sunlight, and Gideon was somewhere in the south pasture, and Tessa was inside with Maisie and could see the approaching wagon from the kitchen window and came to the door to announce it with. The particular expression she used for things she had decided to treat as a threat until proven otherwise. Wagon coming, Tessa said. I see it. One person. A woman. Yes, do you know her? Not yet, Clara said. Tessa went back inside. Clara kept hanging laundry because she was not going to meet Dorothea Crane, looking like she'd dropped everything to receive her. She finished the sheet she was working on and then turned around when the wagon stopped. Dorothea Crane was a woman in her early 60s with a face that had spent decades making decisions and not apologizing for them. She was not large, but she took up space the way compact, well-built things took up space intentionally, effectively, leaving no doubt about their presence. She had gray hair pinned so precisely, it looked architectural, and eyes that went straight to Clara without passing through any intermediate social formalities. You're the Whitlock woman, she said. Clara Whitlock, Clara said. Yes. Dorothea looked at the laundry on the line, then at the house, then through the window at what was clearly a child's face pressing against the glass. I've brought a pie, Dorothea said. Apple, I won't stay long. She did not look like someone who was accustomed to not staying long. They sat at the kitchen table with the pie between them and Tessa, in the corner with a book, She was not reading, and Maisie somewhere closer than she appeared to be. Clara could feel her. That particular presence Maisie had, watchful and still nearby. Dorothea cut 2 slices and gave the first to Clara and the second to Tessa. And Tessa accepted it with the grave courtesy she produced for significant occasions. "All this tells me you arrived in December," Dorothea said. "In the Collier Creek blizzard." "Yes." "Stagecoach went down." "Yes." Dorothea ate a small bite of pie and looked at Clara with direct, uncomplicated appraisal. "I'm going to ask you something plain, and I'd appreciate a plain answer. Not because it's my business exactly, but because in a community this small, what isn't anybody's business has a way of becoming everybody's business when it goes wrong." Clara met her eyes ask, "What are your intentions toward Gideon Rusk?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Beside the fireplace, Tessa had stopped pretending to read. "We have an arrangement," Clara said. "He needed help with the household. I needed work and a safe place for my daughters. We agreed to 1 season to see if it worked. And does it? It seems to." Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. The look was not hostile, and it was not warm. It was the look of someone taking a fair measurement. "Gideon Rusk is a decent man," Dorothea said. "He had a hard year. A very hard year. The kind that changes people in ways they don't always come back from." She set her fork down. "Some men who have had that kind of year become careless. About everything. About the people they let into their lives." "I understand what you're telling me," Clara said. "Do you?" "You're telling me that if I'm careless with him, you'll be aware of it." Something moved in Dorothea's face, not softening, more like recalibration. Picked her fork back up. "And your girls," she said. "The older one looks at everything like she's expecting trouble." "She's had reason to," Clara said. Dorothea looked at Tessa, who looked back at her with that flat, considering gaze. "What's your name?" Dorothea asked her. "Tessa." "How old?" 7. Dorothea studied her. "You look older," she said. Not as a compliment or a criticism, as a fact. "I know," Tessa said. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across and cut a 3rd slice of pie and put it on Tessa's plate without asking. Tessa looked at it, looked at Dorothea. Something in her face ran a calculation. "Thank you," she said. Dorothea left an hour later, which was not exactly short, but was shorter than Clara had expected. From the kitchen window, Clara watched her wagon move back down the road and thought about what had just happened. She was still thinking about it when Gideon came in for the midday meal. She told him, plainly. Dorothea's visit, what was asked, what she'd answered. He listened without interruption, standing with his coat half off, arrested midway through the action of removing it by whatever she was saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What did she say at the end?" he said. "Nothing dramatic. She just said she'd see me at the church social next month." He looked at the wall behind her, which was what he did when he was thinking through something. "That's her way of saying you passed," he said. "The invitation." Clara thought about that. "She's protective of you," she said. "Not accusatory. Just noting it. She was good to Margaret," he said, simply after. "She's not a soft woman, but she was." He shook his head slightly. "She was present in a way that most people weren't." Clara nodded. "I think she'll be good to the girls," she said. They let her. Gideon finished removing his coat and hung it up and said, with his back to her, "Dorothea Crane usually is what she appears to be. Doesn't perform much. That's what I thought." He sat down. She put lunch on the table. They ate, and Tessa ate beside them. And Maisie sat in her place and pushed her food around in the particular way she had when she was thinking instead of hungry, and it was ordinary and small, and Clara let it be ordinary and small and was quietly grateful for it. The conversation happened on a Tuesday night in the 2nd week of March, and Clara did not see it coming. Not the content of it. She had expected something like this to arrive eventually, had known in the way she knew things she didn't let herself think about directly, that the shape of their arrangement was not going to hold its original form indefinitely. People didn't live in close quarters through a Wyoming winter, building something functional out of nothing, without the arrangement shifting on its own. What she hadn't expected was the form it took. She was at the table, mending a shirt Gideon's, one of the working ones, a tear along the left shoulder seam from a fence post, and he was at the other end of the table writing something, the account book he kept for the ranch, scratching of his pen the only sound in the room. The girls were asleep. The fire was low but adequate. The wind was doing its usual business outside. She had been mending for 20 minutes, and he had been writing for 30 when he set his pen down and said, without looking up from the book, "Dorothea's going to talk." Clara kept her eyes on the shirt. "I know. She's not mean-spirited about it. But she will." He closed the account book. "And when she does, the question of what exactly your situation is here becomes the question that has practical consequences." Clara set the shirt down. He was looking at the closed book, not at her. His hands were flat on the table on either side of it. "In this territory," he said, "an unmarried woman living on a man's ranch is a specific kind of story. Doesn't matter how it actually is. It's the kind of story that travels and changes as it travels, and by the time it's done traveling, you're something you never were." He paused. "And a woman whose reputation has that kind of story attached to it has less standing, legally, practically, in front of a judge." Clara's hands went still on the table. He said it flat and direct. "I think you should consider marrying me." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind. The clock on the shelf ticked. Not he stopped. Started again. "Not as anything more than what we already are. An arrangement, but a legal one, with a name and a house and a husband on the record." He looked at her then. "Finally, if Orson ever does find you, if he files those papers, a married woman with an established household is a different legal question than an unmarried woman living on someone else's land." Clara looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. She had considered this. She had turned it around in her mind in the dark hour, those 3 o'clock mornings when honest thinking happened because there was no energy left for the polite kind. She had considered what she was, legally, as a widow in the territory. She had considered the girls. She had considered what Orson would do if he found her, and she believed, with the cold certainty of someone who had watched him operate, that he would find her eventually. Men like Orson didn't give up. They reorganized. She had considered all of it and told herself she was not going to approach Gideon with any version of it, because that was not a thing you asked a man who had given you a bedroom with a lock and a winter and nothing beyond that. She had not expected him to come to it himself. "You've thought this through," she said. "Some." "What does some mean?" "It means I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and I decided tonight to say it instead of keep thinking." She looked down at the shirt in her hands. The mending needle still threaded through the shoulder seam. She thought about the lock on the bedroom door and what he'd said about Margaret. She thought about Dorothea Crane's measuring look. She thought about a Missouri courtroom and a judge who had known Orson Vane's family longer than he'd known Clara's name. "I have conditions," she said. Something in him, some held thing, released. Not visibly just a quality of the silence, like a board that had been under pressure settling. "I expect you do," he said. "The girls come first. Always. You don't pressure them, and you don't demand anything from them they're not ready to give. Not obedience, not affection, not the word." She stopped, collected herself. "Whatever they want to call you is their choice and their timeline, and not something you manage or maneuver toward." Agreed. "This house is not yours and mine in the way that a marriage makes things. My work here is my own. I'm not your property, and I won't be managed." "I'm not interested in managing you," he said. "I have enough to manage." Something almost like a sound worked in her chest. She pressed her lips together. "And if it becomes something neither of us can live with," she said, "we figure out what's next like adults, without ugliness. Yes, those aren't negotiable. I understand that." She looked at him. He looked back. Steady in that way, he was steady, not stone, not cold, just anchored. She had come to understand that about him. He was a man who had found his footing through a terrible year, and held it not by being unmoved, but by deciding, repeatedly, that the ground was worth standing on. "All right," she said. He nodded once. "All right," he said, picked up the shirt and went back to the mending, and he opened the account book and picked up his pen, and they sat at the table in the low firelight for another half hour, in silence that was somehow completely different from the silence before. They married in the first week of April, when the roads had cleared enough for travel, and the world had finally, grudgingly, begun to admit that winter might be releasing its grip. It was not a large ceremony. The minister in town was a thin-voiced man who treated the proceedings with appropriate dignity and no excessive elaboration, which suited both of them. Dorothea Crane was there, because Dorothea Crane made it her business to be where things happened. Aldous was there beside her, looking pleased in the uncomplicated way of a man who liked when things resolved. The ranch hand, a quiet 23-year-old named Petey, whose full name was apparently Peterborough and who had never encouraged anyone to use it, stood near the door with his hat in his hands and an expression of considerable solemnity. Tessa stood beside Clara in a dress that Clara had altered from one of her own, taking it in and shortening it with the same practical focus she brought to all sewing. Tessa's face was doing its careful thing, not happy, not unhappy, fully present and fully private. She had known about the marriage for 4 days. She had asked, in the direct way she asked everything, whether it changed anything. Clara had said, "It changes what we're called. Nothing else." Tessa had thought about it. "Does it change what he's called?" she said. "Only if you decide it does," Clara said. "That's yours. Nobody else's." Tessa had not said anything more about it, and Clara had not pressed. Maisie had been told in simpler terms. She had listened with her solemn attention, and then she had gone back to her drawing, and Clara had no idea what Maisie thought about any of it, and suspected she was working it out in charcoal. The ceremony was short. The vows were the traditional ones. Clara said them in a clear voice that did not waver, because she had made her decision and she kept her decisions, and Gideon said his in his usual flat, direct way, which was to say, without embellishment and without apparent uncertainty. The minister pronounced them married in the sight of God and law, and Dorothea made a small, satisfied sound, and Aldous clapped once before being nudged by his wife into stopping. Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked at Gideon. It was not a look of great romantic transport. It was a look of two people who had just done something significant and were both aware of its weight and were both in their own ways choosing to carry it. He offered his arm for the walk outside, and she took it. That was all. That was enough. The legal notice arrived in the 3rd week of April, 7 days after the wedding, and Clara knew from the return address before she opened it. She opened it anyway. At the kitchen table alone, in the mid-morning, while Gideon was out and the girls were in the yard. She unfolded the paper and read it with the same careful attention she gave to everything she read, making sure she understood what she was looking at before she let herself feel what she was feeling. It was a notice of legal intent to petition for custody, filed in the name of Orson Vane. Citing Clara's abandonment of the family domicile, her transport of minor children across state lines without legal authorization, her placement of said children in conditions unsuitable for their welfare, and her alleged moral and practical unfitness as a primary guardian. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table and put her hands in her lap and sat with it for a moment. He had found her. She had always known he would. She had not known it would be this fast 7 days, as if he'd been watching the road to Cheyenne the whole time, as if he'd had people watching. And she had not known the papers would arrive so quickly, which meant he had already begun the process before he knew her exact location. The filing was the threat. The address was just confirming it. He'd known she was in Wyoming. Maybe not exactly where, but Wyoming. Someone had seen something, or the train records had been checked, or he had simply been thorough in the way that men who had money and determination and the specific coldness of someone with a real objective were thorough. She sat with that knowledge for about 2 minutes. Then she got up and went outside and found Gideon. He was in the south pasture checking fences, still checking fences. There were always fences to check, and he looked up when she came across the field, and something in his face changed when he read her expression. Not alarm, just attention sharpened. She handed him the paper. He read it standing, the fence plier in one hand and the paper in the other. He read it once. Then he folded it and handed it back. "All right," he said. "That's all?" "That's the start." He looked at the fence line, looked back at her. "You expected this?" "Yes. Then we deal with it." He set the plier on the fence post. "We need a lawyer. Not from here, someone from Cheyenne, someone who knows territorial law and isn't connected to anything out of Missouri. That will cost. I have cattle I've been planning to sell in June. I'll sell them in May." Clara looked at him. "Gideon, you're my wife," he said, plainly, without drama. "Those are my daughters now, legally. He wants to fight that. He's going to fight me too." He picked up the plier again. "Go back to the house. I'll be in by noon, and we'll start on the letter." She stood in the pasture and watched him turn back to the fence. She thought about what it would have felt like to be standing in that field alone, holding that paper with no one to turn to. with nowhere the paper couldn't follow her. She had lived in that feeling for months in Missouri, the particular weight of a threat that was always there, always one step behind, that you couldn't name to anyone because naming it made it real and made it visible, and gave the person who'd sent it the satisfaction of watching you flinch. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket and walked back to the house. Tessa met her at the door. "Something happened," Tessa said. "Not a question." Clara looked at her daughter. 7 years old with that old knowledge look, standing in the doorway of a house that was legally theirs now, watching her mother's face for information. "Yes," Clara said. "Is it Uncle Orson?" Clara paused for just a second. "Yes." Tessa's face went very still, the way it went still before she made a decision. "What are we going to do?" she said. And Clara, for the first time in a very long time, had an answer that wasn't just run. "We're going to fight," she said. Tessa looked at her. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. Clara went inside. The days between the letter and Orson's actual arrival were 22 days, and Clara would remember them later as the period during which she understood what it meant to not be alone in a fight. It was not a comfortable understanding. It came with complications and friction, and more than one moment where she had to actively stop herself from trying to manage everything herself, because that was the reflex she had built over years of being the only one. The lawyer came from Cheyenne on a Wednesday, a compact man named Harold Fitch, who wore a good coat and had the eyes of someone who had spent 20 years being told what people didn't want to admit and had developed a specific patience for it. He sat at the kitchen table with Gideon on one side and Clara on the other and listened to everything without interrupting. He asked, when they were done, 4 precise questions and took 3 pages of notes. "Your marriage date," he said, looking at the papers. "Registered, filed the same week," Gideon said. "Good." Fitch made a note. "The girls, you've had them in your household since December. 7 months by the time we'd be in front of a judge." "Yes." "And this Orson Vane, does he have any documented legal claim established prior to your departure from Missouri?" "He filed papers," Clara said. "Guardianship papers. I left before they were finalized." "Before they were finalized," Fitch repeated. "He wrote something. So there's no standing order." "Not that I received." He looked at her over his papers. "Mrs. Rusk, what can you document about your reasons for leaving?" Clara told him. All of it. The nighttime visits, the financial pressure, the papers he'd produced, and the threat behind them. The way it had escalated. She told him without embellishment and without minimizing, using specific dates where she remembered them and being clear where she didn't. Fitch listened. Wrote. When she was done, he put his pen down. "Your older daughter," he said. "How old?" 7. "Is she? What's her state of mind? Would she be able to speak to what she witnessed?" Clara felt Gideon shift slightly in his chair beside her. "She witnessed everything," Clara said carefully. She thought about Tessa standing guard, about the flat watchful look, about the 3 seconds of laughter in February, and how hard it had been to come to. She's been carrying it, all of it. Does she know what's happening? She knows Orson found us. I need to speak with her. Not today, but before any hearing. He looked at his notes. And the younger one? She's 4, Clara said. She doesn't speak much. She stopped. She was affected by the situation in Missouri. She used to talk constantly, Clara said. She stopped about 4 months before we left. Fitch was quiet for a moment. He looked at his papers. Then at Clara. That, he said, is potentially significant. He left 2 hours later with a promise to return and a list of things they needed to gather dates, records, any letters or documents that established the timeline of Orson's behavior. Clara walked him to his horse and stood for a moment in the yard after he rode out, feeling the April air on her face. It was thin air, the April air. Still cold underneath, the way April was in Wyoming, but real, present. Gideon came to stand beside her. "He thinks we can win," she said. "He thinks we have a case," Gideon said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. They stood for a moment. "If it goes wrong," she said. "It's not going to go wrong. But if it does..." His voice was quiet, certain. Not the certainty of someone who didn't know the risk, but the certainty of someone who had decided. "If it goes wrong, I will sell everything on this ranch that can be sold and hire a better lawyer, and we will try again. And if that goes wrong, we will try again after that." She turned and looked at him. His face in the April light was the same face it had always been, weathered and specific, and not beautiful in any way she could have described to someone who hadn't seen it. But there was something in it right now that she had not seen in a man's face in a very long time. Conviction, the real kind. The kind you earned by going through something difficult and deciding to keep standing on the other side. She looked at him, and she felt something move in her chest that she had been very carefully not naming for weeks. Turn back to the road. He'll come himself, she said. Orson. He won't just send lawyers. I know. He'll want to look at what we've built and make it seem like nothing. He can try. Clara's jaw was tight. She felt it and consciously released it. I'm not going to run this time, she said. I know, Gideon said. I mean it. Whatever he does, whatever he says, I am not going to run. I know, he said again. No louder. No less certain. Above them, the Wyoming sky was doing what the Wyoming sky did in April, enormous and pale, and entirely indifferent to human problems, going about its business of just being sky. A hawk was circling somewhere to the north. The south pasture fence was holding. Inside the house, if you listened, you could hear two girls, one teaching the other something, one learning, both alive and present in a house that had a lock on the bedroom door and food in the pantry and a man at the fence line who had sold cattle to pay a lawyer. Clara breathed. Orson was coming. This time she would be waiting. Orson Vane arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of May, and he arrived the way he did everything, with deliberate timing, in the middle of the workday, when he calculated the disruption would be maximum and the preparation minimal. Clara saw the dust from the kitchen window first. 2 horses. A buggy, not a wagon, the kind of vehicle that said, I am not here to work. I am here to be received. She had been expecting it for 11 days, since Fitch had sent word that Orson's legal representative had filed a formal notice of visitation with the territorial court. Expecting it and still feeling, when the dust resolved into a shape she recognized, the specific cold that spread from the center of her chest outward. Not fear. She had decided, somewhere in the weeks between the letter and this moment, that she was done with fear as a primary response. Fear was useful for surviving. It was not useful for fighting. What she had instead, watching that buggy come down the road toward Gideon's gate, was something colder and more functional than fear. Something closer to clarity. She went to the back door and called for Gideon. He was at the woodpile. He heard her voice, read it in a single second, and came. Him and someone else. A suit. She paused. Lawyer. Probably. Gideon nodded. He set the axe against the woodpile with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of message, not rushed, not rattled, just setting a tool down properly so it wouldn't need to be retrieved in a hurry. He wiped his hands on his work pants. Where are the girls? Inside. Tessa knows something's happening. Clara straightened. She always knows. Keep them inside for now. Yes. They walked around to the front of the house together, side by side, and stood on the porch and watched the buggy come through the gate. Clara did not cross her arms. She had thought about this, what her body said, before her mouth did, and she had decided on open hands, straight spine, the stance of someone who was not bracing. Orson Vane had not changed. That was the first thing she noticed, and it hit her somewhere beneath the clarity, the way certain things hit you beneath whatever armor you've built, not through it, but under it. He had not changed at all. He was still the same lean, angular man with the same quality of surface neatness, the kind of neatness that was less about cleanliness than about control, everything placed and nothing accidental. He wore a good coat and a hat that had not seen weather, and he climbed down from the buggy the way he did everything, with practiced ease, as if gravity itself operated on his terms. He looked at Clara, then at Gideon, then at the house, slowly. With the assessing look, she remembered the look that cataloged and diminished at the same time, that turned what you had built into a list of deficiencies. The man who climbed down beside him was younger, 30s, with a leather document case and the contained energy of someone being paid to be useful. Clara Orson said, Mr. Vane, she said. Not his first name, not Orson. The distance of that was deliberate, and she knew he heard it. Something moved in his face. Almost nothing, he was good at almost nothing. But she knew his face. She had been reading it for years. You've done well for yourself, he said, looking at the house again. The tone was complimentary on the surface, and something else entirely underneath. This is my husband, Clara said, Gideon Rusk. Orson looked at Gideon with the specific look of a man who has made a prior judgment and is checking the evidence against it. It was a short look. Whatever he concluded, he put it away. Mr. Rusk, he said, Orson Vane, Henry's brother. I know who you are, Gideon said. Silence for a moment. Kind that had a shape. We'd like to see the girls, Orson said. Turning back to Clara, we're entitled to a welfare assessment as part of the petition process. I believe Mr. Fitch explained the terms. He did, Clara said. You can see them. You won't be alone with them. Orson smiled. It was the smile that had frightened her in Missouri, not because it was threatening, but because it was so thoroughly practiced, so entirely constructed. Of course, he said. That's perfectly reasonable. It was not reasonable to him. Nothing about this was reasonable to him. But he said it the way he said everything, as if he were the adult in the room and everyone else was being managed. They went inside. Tessa was at the table with a book when they came in, which meant she had positioned herself at the table with the book, because Tessa did not read casually when significant things were happening. She looked up when Orson came through the door, and her face did something Clara had never quite seen it do. Before it went absolutely, perfectly still. Not the watchful stillness she used with Gideon in the early weeks, not the careful stillness she used with strangers. A different kind. The stillness of recognition. Orson looked at her. Hello, Tessa, he said. Tessa said nothing. You've grown, he said, pleasantly. The way adults say things to children they don't actually see. Tessa looked at Clara. Clara gave her the smallest nod. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say. Tessa looked back at Orson. Hello, she said. One word. Flat as winter ice. Orson's lawyer, who had introduced himself as Clement, just the last name, the way lawyers who wanted to seem authoritative often did, was taking in the main room with the same cataloging look Orson had used on the exterior. Clara watched him doing it and thought about everything she had done to this house since December. The sealed windows, the organized pantry visible through the kitchen doorway, the mended curtains, the swept floors, the shelves of preserves. Everything that said, this is a functioning household. This is a place where people are cared for. She had not done those things to impress a lawyer. She had done them because they needed doing and because she was a person who did things that needed doing. But she was glad, standing in her own main room with a man trying to find deficiencies, that the evidence was what it was. Maisie had not come out of the bedroom. Orson noticed. The younger one, he said, turning to Clara. Where is she? She'll come out when she's ready. I'd like to see her. I know you would, Clara said. She'll come out when she's ready. Something hardened in Orson's expression, just for a second, just at the edges. Then the smile came back. Of course, he said. Gideon had said almost nothing since they'd come inside. He was standing near the far wall, not behind Clara, not making himself a human barrier, nothing as pointed as that, but present in the way that a solid structure was present. Just there, not moving, not posturing, simply occupying space in the room in a way that was very difficult to overlook. Clement had noticed him. Orson was trying not to. They sat. Clara made no offer of coffee and did not apologize for it. Clement opened his document case and produced several papers that he laid on the table with the careful precision of a man presenting a hand in cards, wanting the effect to be visible. Petition is straightforward, Clement said. His voice was practiced and smooth, the voice of someone who had delivered bad news enough times to have found the tone that made it sound like reason. Mrs. Rusk or Whitlock, the name on the original documentation being somewhat. Rusk, Clara said. My name is Clara Rusk. Clement paused. Adjusted. Mrs. Rusk. The petition contends that the removal of the minor children from the state of Missouri was conducted without proper legal notice and in contravention of the pending guardianship proceedings. Mr. Vane as the surviving paternal uncle and nearest male relative. Henry's brother is not a guardian, Clara said. Henry didn't designate one. There was no finalized legal document. The petition was filed, Clara said, not finalized. I left before it was finalized, which is not the same as violating a standing order, as, I believe, Mr. Fitch has already communicated in writing. Clement looked at her. He recalibrated, very slightly. Orson was watching Clara with an expression she had not seen from him before, or rather an expression he was not quite managing to conceal. Something that was not the smooth certainty she'd always faced. Something that looked, briefly, like recalculation. Good, she thought. Let him recalculate. The children's welfare is the central concern, Clement said, recovering. The court will wish to establish that they are in a suitable environment, that their physical and emotional needs are being met, and that the arrangement, relatively recent and somewhat irregular in its establishment, is in their long-term interests. My daughters are healthy, Clara said. They are fed and clothed and educated, and they are in a home with two parents who— A marriage of 4 weeks, Orson said. He said it quietly, not interrupting, exactly waiting for the precise moment to place the word where it would land hardest. A marriage of 4 weeks, he repeated, to a man they met 5 months ago, in circumstances that any court will characterize as irregular. A man with no blood relation to these children, no prior connection, no established. He is their father, Clara said. He is a man you married quickly under legal pressure, Orson said. His voice was still pleasant. The pleasantness was the most frightening thing about it. The total control of surface, while he worked underneath it. The court will see a widow, who transported 2 children across state lines, entered into a hasty arrangement with a stranger, and formalized it the moment legal proceedings began. Clara said nothing. She felt Gideon move, slightly, near the wall, and she put her hand up not dramatically. Just a small motion, not yet, and he stilled. Judge Orson continued. Looking at those facts, might reasonably conclude that stability and continuity would be better served by. By what? Clara said. By you? By an established family environment with appropriate. Orson. She used his first name time deliberately, and it cut through the practiced cadence of his speech. You have never been interested in those girls. You have been interested in Henry's estate, in what was owed to you when Henry died and you found out what the will actually said. She kept her voice even. Those children are not an inheritance. You cannot file papers on them like their property. The room was very quiet. Clement was looking at his papers. Not writing, just looking at them. Orson's expression had changed. The smile was still technically there. Structured and moved, but whatever it had been built on was no longer supporting it properly. You should have stayed in Missouri, he said. Quiet. Quiet that had once preceded the nighttime visits. The documents, the escalating pressure. You should have accepted reasonable arrangements. I should have left sooner, Clara said. He stood up. Gideon straightened from the wall. We'll see each other at the hearing, Orson said. To the room. To no one specifically, Clara said. We will. He left his lawyer's papers on the table and walked out. Clement gathered them up with the efficiency of someone accustomed to exits, made before the conversation concluded, and followed. Clara heard the buggy move down the road. She sat at the table and put both hands flat on the wood and breathed. From the bedroom doorway, very quietly, Maisie appeared. She had been there Clara didn't know for how long. Long enough. She stood in the doorway, holding the wooden horse that Gideon had carved, the replacement she'd found after the first one was lost, and she looked at the space where Orson had been. Clara. Is he gone, she said. Yes, Clara said. He's gone. Maisie came to the table and climbed into Clara's lap without asking, which she hadn't done since Missouri, and put her face against Clara's shoulder, and Clara held her and looked at Gideon over the top of her head. He looked back. We need to call Fitch today, Clara said. I know. He was already moving toward the writing desk. Community, as it turned out, had opinions. This surprised Clara, though it probably shouldn't have. She had lived in small communities before in Missouri, in her grandmother's Kansas homestead, in the various places Henry's work had taken them, and she knew the particular texture of how news moved in a place where everyone's business was eventually adjacent to everyone else's. She had expected some to lean toward Orson, or at least toward the legal argument he represented, the established family, the prior claim, the skepticism toward a woman who had shown up from nowhere and married quickly. She had not expected what actually happened. What actually happened began with Dorothea Crane. 3 days after Orson's visit, Dorothea appeared at the ranch. Not with Aldous this time alone, in her own small wagon, which meant she had come with something specific to say and didn't want an audience for the saying of it. She came inside. She accepted coffee. She looked at Clara across the kitchen table with the clear, direct look that Clara had come to understand was just how Dorothea looked at everything. I've heard, Dorothea said. I assumed you would. What he said. About the marriage. The timeline. She wrapped her hands around the cup. There's already talk. I know. Some of it's not kind. Dorothea paused. Most of it's ignorant, which is worse. People who don't know what they're talking about generally talk more confidently than people who do. Clara said nothing. I want to know, Dorothea said, what actually happened in Missouri. I want to know it from you, and I want to know all of it, because I am not going to speak for something I only half understand. Clara looked at her. Speak for it, Hal, she said carefully. Dorothea Crane has been in this territory for 19 years, Dorothea said, with the specific dryness of someone who rarely needed to point to their own standing. When Dorothea Crane vouches for someone, it carries weight. And I intend to vouch for you, Clara Rusk, because I have been watching you for 3 months, and I know what I see. But I need to know what I'm vouching for. Something moved in Clara's chest. Something that was not quite the safe feeling from that first night, but related to it. Particular sensation of being seen by someone with clear eyes who had decided to stand next to you. She told Dorothea everything. The same everything she had told Fitch, but different, less organized, less legally calibrated, more human. She told her about the nighttime visits, about the papers, about watching Maisie go quieter and quieter until the quiet became something frightening. About Tessa learning to read the room and stand guard and perform a 7-year-old's version of constant vigilance. About the night she'd read Gideon's advertisement by a guttering candle and lied in her letter because she was desperate and running out of road. She told her about the blizzard, about Maisie's blue lips, about the locked door and what Gideon had said about Margaret. Dorothea listened without interruption, the way she apparently did everything completely present, not gathering her response while the other person talked, but actually listening. When Clara finished, Dorothea was quiet for a long moment. That child, she said. The little one. She's still not talking much. More than she was, Clara said. She's getting better. Because she feels safe, yes. Dorothea set her cup down. And that man wants to put her back in the situation that made her stop talking in the first place. He'd say the situation was my fault. That a stable family environment. With him in it, Dorothea said flatly, yes. Dorothea stood up. She buttoned her coat in the precise, definitive way she did everything. I'll speak to Reverend Marcia's wife, she said, and the Hendersons. And young Petey, your ranch hand, he'll need to know what's expected of him if this goes to a hearing. Clara blinked. Expected of him? He's lived here since October. He's seen those girls every day. He's seen how you run this household and how Gideon manages his land and how those children are treated. Dorothea picked up her gloves. A court that's being told you're unfit needs to hear from people who've watched you be fit, day in and day out, in the ordinary way of things. Clara was quiet. You didn't ask me to do this, Dorothea said. No. That's partly why I'm doing it. She moved toward the door. The other part is that I don't like that man. I saw his face when he looked at this house, and I know that look. It's the look of a man who counts what other people have and decides it's his. She left. Clara stood in her kitchen and thought that she had arrived in Wyoming in a blizzard and somehow, without intending it, built something. Not just the household. Something else. A web of small accumulated trust, Dorothea's assessing eye, Aldous' uncomplicated goodwill, Petey's steady, quiet presence, even the minister's wife, who had nodded at Clara last month at the church social with the specific nod of someone who had made a positive judgment and was registering it. She had not been building it consciously. She had been living, and living honestly, and apparently that was enough. Fitch came back the following week with news that cut 2 directions at once. The hearing was set for the end of May, which was sooner than they'd hoped. Orson's lawyers had pushed for speed, presumably calculating that less time gave Clara less preparation. The judge was a territorial man named Beaumont, whom Fitch knew by reputation as even-tempered and resistant to out-of-territory influence, which was good. The venue would be the county seat, which was a day's ride, which was manageable. The thing that cut the other direction was the witness list Orson's lawyers had submitted. He has 3 witnesses, Fitch said, laying the document on the table. One is a woman from Buchanan County, who will apparently testify to observations of your household management in Missouri. One is a former neighbor who will speak to the, quote, turbulent nature of your marriage to the late Henry Whitlock. He paused. And the third? Clara said. Fitch looked at her steadily. A physician from Kansas City who will testify that Maisie's reduced verbal engagement is consistent with, quote, inadequate maternal environment. The room was completely silent. Clara felt the specific cold of that, not in her chest this time, but in her hands. Her hands went cold the way they had when Orson had first produced the guardianship papers in Missouri. The cold of understanding that someone had been studying how to hurt you, specifically with thought and preparation. Gideon said, very quietly, they hired someone to say she's damaged because of Clara. They're going to argue that Maisie's condition is evidence of poor parenting, Fitch said. He said it without apology, because a lawyer who softened things you needed to understand clearly was less useful than one who said them plainly. It's cynical, and I think we can counter it, but I want you both to know it's coming. Clara's jaw was so tight she could feel it in her back teeth. She thought about Maisie. Maisie carrying the wooden horse everywhere. Maisie's drawings, the fourth figure moving closer. Maisie in the kitchen doorway this morning, watching Clara make bread with the serious concentrated attention she brought to everything she wanted to learn, and saying, unprompted, I want to do that part, pointing at the kneading and the way her small hands had pressed into the dough with a 4-year-old's wholehearted commitment. They were going to walk into a courtroom and say that child's silence was Clara's fault. She thought about what it would cost Maisie, who had barely recovered the thread of her own voice, to have her silence turned into a legal argument, to be reduced to evidence. She thought about Orson, who had watched Maisie go quiet in that house in Missouri, who had been there for it, had contributed to it, and was now prepared to cite it in court. What do we do? She said. Her voice was flat in a way that was not anger, but contained it. Fitch had a list. Of course he had a list. He was a prepared man. They needed Maisie evaluated by their own physician, someone who could testify to her current state and trajectory. They needed character witnesses, and Dorothea Crane was already positioned, which Fitch noted with the specific approval of a man who understood what a voice like that was worth. They needed Petey on the record. The Hendersons, if they were willing. Anyone who had seen the household functioning as a household. And there's one more thing, Fitch said. He looked at Clara. Tessa, he said. Clara shook her head. She's 7, Gideon said. She's a witness, Fitch said. Not in the traditional sense, a child her age wouldn't be called to testify formally. But a written account, in her own words, of what she witnessed in Missouri, submitted as a record that's different. A judge who reads a 7-year-old girl's own description of what frightened her is reading something he can't discount as adult interpretation. Clara was quiet for a long time. She'd have to want to do it, Clara said finally. Yes. I'm not going to ask her. Fitch nodded. Then it doesn't happen. Clara looked at the table, at the wood grain she had polished until it showed its own color, at the window with its resealed frame, at the jar on the kitchen shelf. She had started one, not consciously, just had started putting interesting things in a jar on the shelf, a blue button and a quartz pebble and a small perfect pine cone, and she hadn't examined why until this moment. I'll talk to her, she said. I'll tell her what it is and what it would mean, and I'll let her decide. The conversation with Tessa happened that evening, after supper, when Maisie was asleep and Gideon had gone to check the horses, and it was just the two of them at the table. In the way they sometimes were, Clara with her mending, Tessa with her book, comfortable parallel quiet they had always had between them. Clara set her mending down. Tessa looked up. I need to tell you something about the hearing, Clara said. Tessa closed the book. She gave Clara her full attention, the way she gave everything her full attention completely, without reservation. Clara told her about the hearing, about the witnesses Orson had prepared, about what they were going to say about Maisie. She told her plainly and didn't soften the edges, because Tessa was a child who could tell when edges had been softened, and it made her distrust the person who'd done it. When she finished, Tessa was quiet for a moment. They're going to say Maisie's the way she is because of you, Tessa said. Flat, factual. Yes, that's Elias. Tessa looked at the table. Her jaw was tight in the way Clara's went tight when she was containing something. Mr. Fitch thinks, Clara said carefully, that if you wanted to write down what you saw in Missouri, what Orson did, what it was like a judge reading that would understand things that are hard to explain otherwise. Yeah. But it's your choice. Completely, you don't have to. Tessa looked up. Fitch thinks so. I don't know for certain. Would it help Maisie? Clara held her daughter's gaze. It might. Tessa was quiet for a long time. Clock on the shelf ticked. From outside, Very faint, the sound of Gideon in the barn. I remember everything, Tessa said. I always remember everything. Mama always says it's. She stopped. I never forgot any of it. I know, sweetheart. He came at night, Tessa said. Her voice was steady with the steadiness she had built, brick by deliberate brick, over months. He knocked on the door at night, and you would go quiet, and I would listen through the wall, and I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. She looked at the table, and Maisie heard it too. She was in the same room as me. She would put her hands over her ears. Clara pressed her lips together hard. I'll write it, Tessa said. I want to write it. You're sure? He doesn't get to lie about Maisie, Tessa said. Can't, she's 4. She can't go in a courtroom and say what happened. So I'll do it. Clara looked at her daughter, 7 years old with old eyes and a set jaw and a book closed on the table in front of her like something she'd put aside because more important work had come up. I'll help you with spelling, Clara said. That's all. The words are yours, I know, Tessa said. She reached for the paper and pencil that were always on the table's edge. I'll start now. She started writing. Clara picked up her mending. They sat at the table together in the lamplight while Tessa's pencil moved steadily across the page, and the clock ticked, and outside in the barn, Gideon was doing whatever needed doing, and somewhere in the bedroom, Maisie was dreaming. The way children dreamed when they felt safe deeply, without the surface alertness that bad sleep brought. Tessa wrote for 2 hours, 7 pages, in the round, careful handwriting of a child who had learned her letters seriously. Clara did not read it that night. She folded it carefully and put it in the envelope for Fitch, and looked at her daughter's handwriting on the outside of the envelope and thought about what it cost a 7-year-old to remember everything. The night before the hearing, Gideon found Clara on the porch. It was late past 10, the kind of late that meant the house had been quiet for hours, and they were both still awake. She was sitting on the step with her coat around her shoulders, and the May night doing its cool, clean business around her, and he came out and stood for a moment, and then sat down beside her. Not touching was still that careful distance that had been theirs. Since the beginning, the mutual respect of two people who had not fully renegotiated what the territory between them was. Can't sleep, she said, not a question. No, they sat. The Wyoming night in May was not the Wyoming night in January. It had a different texture, less absolute. The cold more provisional, the stars the same, but the air between them and the earth somehow less hostile. She had learned the night sky, out here in a way she never had in Missouri, where there had always been something else to look at, some more immediate thing. Out here in the dark, the sky was unavoidable. I keep running it, she said. The hearing. Going through it. I know. All the things he could say. All the ways Clement will frame it. She paused. All the things I should have said when he was in this house and didn't. You said the right things, did I? You didn't flinch, he said. That mattered. Clara looked at her hands in the darkness. Tomorrow they would go to the county seat and sit in a room and listen to Orson's lawyers, try to take her children. And she would have to sit still and not flinch and trust that the truth was enough. She had spent a long time not trusting that the truth was enough. What if it goes wrong, she said. He didn't say it won't go wrong this time, the way he had in the pasture. He thought about it instead, actually sat with the question, and she appreciated that more than the reassurance would have been. If it goes wrong, he said, we come home, and we figure out what's next from home. He paused. But it's not going to go wrong. You can't know that. No, he said. I can't know it. I just think it. Clara almost laughed. It was too tired and too real for laughter, but the shape of it moved in her chest. Tessa called you something today, she said. When you were in the barn, I was near the window. He went still beside her. She called you. Clara stopped. Started again. She said, ask him. He'll know to Maisie. And she said, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Gideon sat on the porch, step beside her, and said nothing at all. And she could feel, through some quality of the air between them, what that word was doing to him. Not the word itself, the fact of it. The fact that a 7-year-old girl, who had spent months learning whether he was safe, had decided, on her own timeline, in her own private vocabulary, what to call him. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different quality than she had heard from him before. I didn't hear it, he said. I know. Are you sure that's what she? I'm sure, Clara said. He was quiet. She looked at him in the dark, at the side of his face, at the particular quality of his stillness. She thought about Margaret's rock collection. She thought about the wooden horse. She thought about a man who had opened a door in a blizzard and mentioned the lock first, and moved to the kitchen floor without complaint and sold cattle for a lawyer he hadn't needed until her problem became his problem. Most of its windows were dark. She thought about what she had been calling the thing in her chest and whether she was still going to keep not calling it what it was. Gideon, she said. He turned to look at her. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief, careful. She pulled back and looked at him, and his face in the dark was doing the thing it did when he was processing something real. Not the performative version, not the managed version, just the actual internal weather of a person responding to something true. Thought we said he started. I know what she said. I'm saying something different now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face very gently, with the rough, careful hands of a man who did precise work with imprecise tools and had learned to adjust for the difference. Tomorrow first, he said. Tomorrow first, she agreed. They sat on the porch until the cold made them go inside, and Clara slept better than she had any right to expect. And in the morning, she got up and put on her best dress and woke her daughters, and they loaded into the wagon and drove to the county seat to face Orson Vane for the last time. The county seat was a 3-hour ride, and they made it mostly in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. The silence of people who had said what needed saying the night before and were now conserving themselves for what came next. Tessa sat beside Clara in the wagon bed, with her back straight and her hands in her lap, watching the road unreal ahead of them, with that particular focus she brought to things she had decided to endure. Maisie sat on Clara's other side, pressed against her arm, the wooden horse in her coat pocket where it always was now. Her small weight warm and constant. Gideon drove. Clara watched the back of his shoulders and thought about last night on the porch and did not let herself think about anything beyond today. Today was the only thing that mattered. Everything else could wait. The town of Garnet Creek was not large a main street, a courthouse that was newer than everything around it, and wore its newness a little self-consciously, a hotel, 3 dry goods establishments, a livery. They arrived at 9:30. Which was an hour before the hearing, which Fitch had specified as the minimum acceptable margin. Fitch was already there, standing outside the courthouse door with his document case, and the expression of a man who had prepared as thoroughly as preparation allowed and was now in the hands of what actually happened. He looked at Clara when the wagon stopped, looked at Gideon, looked at the girls, Mrs. Rusk, Mr. Fitch. Are you ready? Clara climbed down from the wagon. She straightened her coat. She looked at the courthouse, which was just a building, wood and glass, and a door. The same materials as everything else, not more significant than what she decided to make it. Yes, she said. They went in. The waiting room outside the hearing chamber was a narrow space with wooden benches and a window that looked out on the side alley where nothing was happening. Clara sat on one bench, and Tessa sat beside him, which Clara noticed and filed away in the part of her that was always noticing things about her daughters. Fitch stood near the door, going through his papers one more time, the rehearsed focus of a man who trusted process, because process was what he had. Orson arrived 12 minutes later. He came in with Clement, and a second man Clara didn't recognize, younger, who carried a second document case. 3 people to her, too. She looked at that arithmetic and decided not to let it mean anything. Orson did not look at her directly when he came in. He looked at the room, then at Fitch, then at Gideon with that brief assessing look. Then he sat on the opposite bench, and Clement arranged papers, and the second young man arranged papers, and the room had the specific held quality of a space where people were waiting to fight and being civil about it in the interim. Tessa was watching Orson. Clara could feel it without turning her head. The quality of Tessa's attention in that direction fixed, unblinking, full weight of a 7-year-old who remembered everything and had written it down, and had folded the paper herself and put it in Fitch's hands and said, "I want him to read it." Orson eventually felt it. He looked at Tessa. Tessa looked back at him. She did not look away, did not adjust her expression, did not perform anything, not bravery, not defiance, not the childish, withering look of a child trying to seem tough. She simply looked at him with clear, direct, unmediated recognition. The look of someone who saw exactly what he was and was not afraid of being seen seeing it. Something moved in Orson's face. He looked away first. Clara breathed. Judge Beaumont was a man of about 60, with a gray beard, cut close, and the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to make his courtroom feel measured rather than rushed. He did not look like a man who was impressed by legal maneuvering. He looked like a man who had seen enough of it to have developed a permanent mild skepticism toward its more elaborate forms. He read both parties' filings before opening statements, which took 8 minutes. Clara watched him read. Fitch had told her that what happened in those 8 minutes, the quality of attention the judge brought to the documents, what he lingered over, what he moved through quickly, often told you more about how the day would go than anything said aloud. Beaumont lingered over Tessa's account. He read it twice. Clara could see him go back to the beginning after reaching the end, his finger not touching the page but tracking near it, following the round, careful handwriting of a 7-year-old who remembered everything. She watched his face while he read it the second time. Something changed in it. Not dramatically. Beaumont was not a man who let his face be dramatic. But something settled differently in the set of his jaw, some prior configuration shifting into something else. Clara had been a reader of faces her whole adult life, out of necessity, and she read his the way she read everything, carefully, without putting more weight on what she saw than the evidence warranted. What she saw was a man who was recalibrating. She did not let herself feel anything about that yet. Opening statements came first. Clement spoke for Orson's side with the practiced fluency of someone who had delivered versions of this particular argument before the concern for the children's welfare. The question of stability, the irregularity of the current arrangement, the legal ambiguity of Clara's departure. He was good. He was disciplined. He made the case sound reasonable, even compassionate, as if the thing Orson wanted was the natural conclusion of concern rather than the mechanism of control it actually was. Fitch was shorter and more specific. He laid out the timeline. December arrival, the condition in which they'd arrived, the subsequent months, the household, the marriage, the witnesses who would speak to what they had seen. Most of its windows were dark. He mentioned Tessa's account without quoting it, simply noting that it existed and had been submitted, and he watched Beaumont when he said it. Beaumont did not react visibly. Then Clement called his witnesses. The woman from Buchanan County was named Mrs. Aldgate, and she spoke in the precise tones of someone who had rehearsed, which meant she was credible as on the surface and hollow a half-inch beneath it. She described the Whitlock household as she had observed it not badly. Clara noted with grim interest. Not badly at all. What she described was a household managed adequately by a woman who was, in Mrs. Aldgate's assessment, clearly overwhelmed by her circumstances following her husband's death. She did not say Clara was a bad mother. She said she seemed very tired. That was clever. Clara recognized the cleverness of it, not a direct accusation, but an impression, a suggestion. Something Fitch could not easily cross-examine because there was nothing specific enough to dispute. Fitch cross-examined her for seven minutes and established that she had visited the Whitlock home exactly twice in the period following Henry's death, that she had not been present for any of Orson's visits, and that her observations of Clara's fatigue post-bereavement were not distinguishable from the fatigue of any woman managing a household and 2 children alone in the months after her husband's death. Mrs. Aldgate agreed to all of this in the careful way of someone who'd been coached to agree to things that sounded like concessions, but weren't. The neighbor spoke next, and was worse not because he was more damaging, but because what he said was more personal. He described Henry and Clara's marriage as one marked by tension, by Clara's independence, which he characterized as stubbornness, by arguments that he claimed were frequent and sharp. He said Henry had confided concerns about Clara's temperament. He said it all with the sad certainty of a man who had decided he was telling a hard truth. Clara sat very still. She thought about Henry, about the marriage that had been real and complicated, and had contained genuine affection alongside genuine friction the way most long marriages did, about how a person's memory of something could be selectively true, could contain facts arranged in a particular order to tell a story that the facts unordered did not actually tell. She thought about what it meant that Orson had found this man and prepared him. Fitch's cross-examination was more pointed this time. He established that the neighbor had a long-standing professional relationship with the Vane family of financial connection. A debt restructured through Henry's brother, a favor of the kind that left impressions. He did not call the man a liar. He simply made visible the structure in which the man's testimony existed and left Beaumont to do the arithmetic. Then came the physician. He was a young man, younger than Clara expected, with the careful credentials of someone who had been chosen for his credentials rather than his experience. He spoke about childhood development, about the relationship between early verbal expression and parental responsiveness, about what he characterized as evidence of disrupted attachment in children who underwent maternal stress in early years. He did not say Clara had harmed Maisie. He said the evidence was consistent with the possibility of inadequate maternal environment. Clara felt Gideon shift slightly beside her. She put her hand on his arm. Not dramatically, just a touch, steady. Fitch cross-examined the physician with a patience that was itself a statement. He asked how long the physician had observed Maisie Whitlock. The answer was 4 hours, in a clinical examination conducted 3 weeks prior. Most of its windows were dark. He asked whether the physician was aware that the child in question had recovered significant verbal function in the preceding months. The physician acknowledged he had been informed of this. Fitch asked whether, in the physician's professional assessment, a child who was recovering verbal function was doing so in an environment that supported or undermined that recovery. The physician said, after a pause that was a half-second too long, recovery of that kind would typically indicate a supportive environment. Fitch let that sit for a moment. No further questions, he said. Dorothea Fitz Crane took the stand with the bearing of someone who considered this proceeding a mild inconvenience she was prepared to address completely. She stated her name, her 19 years in the territory, her position in the community, with the specific matter-of-fact brevity of someone who did not need to perform authority because they simply had it. She said she had known Gideon Rusk for 11 years, and had known Clara Rusk since her arrival in December, and she described what she had observed in that household with the precision of a woman who paid attention and the credibility of one who was known to say exactly what she thought. She said the children were healthy. She said the household was well run. She said Tessa was a serious and capable child, and that Maisie, in the months since arrival, had changed visibly, had begun speaking more, had begun engaging, had begun doing the things 4-year-old children did when they felt, in Dorothea's word, settled. She said she had observed Gideon Rusk with those children on multiple occasions, and she had seen patience, and she had seen consistency, and she had seen the ordinary, unglamorous daily work of a man who was present. Clement cross-examined her for 12 minutes and accomplished nothing visible. Dorothea answered his questions with the polite completeness of someone who had nothing to hide and was mildly entertained by the attempt. After Dorothea came Petey. Peterborough Alcott, his full name said aloud for the first time in years, producing a slightly startled expression on his own face. He was 23 years old and looked younger, and spoke slowly, in the careful way of someone who did not talk a great deal and took the occasions when he did seriously. He described arriving on the Rusk Ranch in October, before Clara. He described what the ranch had been then maintained, functional, but quiet in a way that he said simply was not comfortable. He said when Clara and the girls arrived, it was different. He said different, how, when Fitch asked, and he thought about it and said the house had a sound to it that it hadn't had before. People in it, regular meals, the smell of things being cleaned and cooked. He said the little girl Maisie had started saying hello to him in the mornings around February, and that it was the kind of thing you noticed because you hadn't expected it. He said Gideon Rusk was a good man who had had a bad year, and that the Rusk Ranch was, in his observation, a good place for children to grow up. He said it without flourish, looking at the judge with the direct gaze of someone who had nothing to embellish because the plain version was what he'd seen. Clement chose not to cross-examine him. Clara thought that was probably the right calculation. Then Fitch called Clara. She had known this was coming, had prepared for it in the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly, without false comfort, looking at it directly until she understood its shape. Fitch had told her what questions he would ask. He had told her to answer them completely and without editorializing, to keep her voice even, to look at Beaumont rather than at Orson when she was speaking. She stood up. Gideon's hand found her arm for a second, just a second, and then she walked to the front of the room and sat in the witness chair and looked at Judge Beaumont. He looked back at her, with the same measured attention he'd given everything else. She found that she was not afraid of that look. It was an honest look. A look that was actually seeing her, rather than the story it had already decided on. Fitch walked her through it. The marriage to Henry. His death. The months following the management of the estate. The arrival of Orson's interest. She described the visits, how they had begun, how they had escalated, the specific incidents she remembered with dates and details. She described the papers, what he'd said when he produced them, the specific language he had used. She described the night she'd decided to leave, not dramatically, not as a story she'd shaped for effect, but as it had actually been, a woman at a table with a candle, and 2 sleeping children, and a letter she was writing, because all the roads she'd looked at led to the same ending, and this was the only one that didn't. She described the blizzard. She described arriving at Gideon's ranch with Maisie in her arms and not knowing what she would find, and finding what she found. She described the months since. She described her daughters, who Tessa was, who Maisie was, who they had been before Missouri, and who they were becoming now. She said that Maisie had spoken 14 words yesterday morning, between waking up and breakfast, which she knew because she was the kind of mother who counted them, not out of worry but out of joy, because every word was a word that had come back from wherever the silence had taken it. Her voice stayed even. She had decided it would stay even, and it did. Then Fitch asked her directly, "Why did you not disclose the existence of your daughters in your original correspondence with Mr. Rusk?" Clara looked at Beaumont. "Because I was afraid he would say no," she said. "And if he said no, I had nowhere else to go that Orson couldn't follow. I lied because I was desperate, and I would make the same choice again because my daughters are here and they are safe, and I would do whatever it took to make that true." She said it clearly, without apology for the lie, without excessive justification, just the plain truth of it. Fitch sat down. Clement stood up. He was measured. He was skillful. He worked through the cross-examination with the focused patience of a man who understood that his best material was the timeline and the speed of the marriage. And he returned to it from several angles: the 4 weeks between arrival and ceremony, the fact of the pending legal proceedings as a context, the question of whether a man who had known a woman 5 months could be said to have made an informed and genuine commitment to her children. Clara answered every question. She did not become defensive. She did not qualify excessively. She said, the marriage was practical in its origins and had become more than that. She said, Gideon Rusk had made a commitment to those children not in a courtroom and not in a ceremony, but on a night in December when he opened a door in a blizzard and saw a child with blue lips and acted accordingly. She said, you can call the timeline short. What you cannot call it is false. Clement asked finally, Mrs. Rusk, is it your position that a man you met 5 months ago qualified to be the father of your daughters? Clara looked at him. A man I met 5 months ago is their father, she said. He became that by what he did, not by when he did it. Gideon took the stand. He sat in the witness chair the way he sat everywhere, without performance, without adjustment, taking up exactly his actual space and no more. He looked at Fitch when Fitch was asking questions, and at Beaumont when Beaumont was relevant, and at the room in general with the settled directness of a man who had decided on something and wasn't revisiting it. Fitch asked him about the ranch, about the months since December, about the girls, specifically what he had observed, what had changed, what he understood his role to be. Gideon answered in the flat, specific way he answered everything. He described the wooden horse, without calling it a gesture or a symbol, just said he'd made it and left it, and that Maisie had found it and kept it for weeks, and that he'd made another one when the first one was lost. He described the conversation with Tessa in the barn. Not the content of it, but the fact of it that she had come in and asked him a direct question and he had given her a direct answer, and that was the entirety of what he knew how to offer. He said he was not a man who was good at explaining himself, which was why he was going to say the following plainly. He had not been looking for a family. He had been managing without one. Then 3 people had come through his door in a blizzard, and he had made decisions day by day, small decisions, and those decisions had accumulated into something he had not intended but recognized. And you recognized family, the way you recognized anything real, not because someone told you what it was, but because it was already there when you looked. Clement stood. His cross-examination of Gideon was shorter than Clara's, which she thought was probably smart. Gideon was not a witness you could rattle with implication or unsettle with reframing. He was too literal for that, too attached to what was actually true to be maneuvered by what could be made to seem true. Clement asked, "Mr. Rusk, would you say your relationship to these children was established out of affection or out of circumstance?" Gideon looked at him. "Both," he said, "same as most real things." Clement paused. "No further questions," he said. Then Fitch said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Orson Vane." The room shifted. Clement was on his feet immediately, but Beaumont waved him back down the motion of a man who had already decided something and was not interested in the objection. Orson looked, for the first time, like a man who had miscalculated. He took the stand. Fitch was different with Orson than he had been with Clara or Gideon. Not aggressive, nothing as obvious as that, but precise in a way that had a point. He asked about the guardianship filing, about the timeline of it when Orson had begun the process, what documentation he had, whether the filing had been completed before or after Clara's departure. He asked about the financial circumstances of Henry Whitlock's estate, about what Orson had inherited directly and what remained in question. He asked about the visits to Clara's household in the months following Henry's death. Orson was composed. He answered in the careful way of a man who had been prepared, giving enough information to seem cooperative, and not enough to give anything away. He characterized the visits as concern. He characterized the guardianship filing as protection. He characterized Clara's departure as abandonment of responsible process. Fitch let him characterize. Then he said, "Mr. Vane, were you present in the Whitlock household on the evening of September 14th of last year?" Pause. "I may have visited on that occasion," Orson said. "Were you present?" Fitch said, with the specificity of someone who has a document and is measuring the testimony against it, "on the evening of September 14th, after 10 o'clock at night?" Another pause. Longer. "I don't recall the exact time." "Do you recall what you said to Mrs. Whitlock on that occasion?" "We discussed the estate arrangements." "At 10 o'clock at night." "I don't recall the exact time." Fitch reached into his document case and produced a paper. He handed it to Beaumont before he spoke, which Clara recognized as a deliberate sequence. Let the judge see it first. "Mr. Vane," Fitch said, "I have here a written account from Tessa Whitlock, age 7, describing in her own words what she heard through the wall of her bedroom on the night of September 14th. She describes hearing you tell her mother that the children would be removed whether Clara cooperated or not. She describes hearing her mother's voice and then silence. She describes her sister Maisie putting her hands over her ears." He paused. "Any of that inaccurate?" Orson's composure was intact. "Barely. A child's recollection," he said, "of a conversation she wasn't present for." "She was present," Fitch said. "She was in the next room. She heard it through the wall." He paused. "Was any of it inaccurate?" Clement objected. Beaumont heard it and overruled it with a brevity that said something. Orson looked at the table in front of him. "The conversation may have been heated," he said. "Discussions about estate management can become—" "Was any of it inaccurate?" Fitch said for the third time, with the patience of a man who had decided on a question and would ask it until he received an answer. A silence that lasted long enough to answer itself. "I may have expressed my position strongly," Orson said. Fitch sat down. Beaumont looked at Orson for a moment. Then he called a recess. They stood in the side alley, the four of them, Clara, Gideon, Fitch, and Tessa, who had come out because she said she needed air, and Clara had not argued. Maisie was inside with Dorothea, which was its own indication of something, because Maisie had decided approximately 6 weeks ago that Dorothea Crane was trustworthy, a judgment she had apparently made based on criteria known only to herself, and which Clara had not questioned. Fitch said he admitted enough. "Is enough enough?" Gideon said. "Beaumont?" Fitch considered. "Yes, I think so." The physician undermined himself on cross. "The neighbor's financial connection to the Vane family is now on record. Aldgate said nothing that actually damaged your case, and several things that accidentally supported it." He looked at Clara. "Your testimony was exactly right. Not too much, not shaped for effect." "Will he rule today?" Clara asked. "He might, or he'll take a day. He's not a man who performs deliberation he hasn't actually done." Fitch looked at the courthouse door. "I've appeared before Beaumont 6 times. He rules on the evidence and what it means for the people in front of him. not on the argument. Clara looked at the alley wall. An ordinary wall. Brick and mortar, the same as any wall anywhere. She thought about the night she'd written the letter. Candle burning down. 2 girls asleep in the next room. The particular desperation of a woman who has looked at every road and seen the same ending on all of them except one. She thought about a ranch in Wyoming and a man who mentioned the lock first. She thought about Tessa laughing at the name Buttercup. She thought about a jar on a kitchen shelf with a blue button and a quartz pebble and a small perfect pine cone. Tessa was standing against the alley wall with her arms at her sides, looking at nothing in particular. She had the expression she used when she was done processing something and had moved into whatever came next. Clara went to stand beside her. "You okay?" she said. Tessa said, "You sure?" "I wrote down the truth," Tessa said. "That's all I could do." She looked at her mother. "Did it help?" "Yes," Clara said it helped. Tessa nodded, filed it, went back to looking at the wall. Clara put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and Tessa allowed it, and they stood like that in the alley in the May afternoon until Fitch said the recess was over. Judge Beaumont did not take a day. He came back from recess, settled in his chair, looked at his papers for approximately 30 seconds, and looked up. He spoke for 11 minutes. Clara would not remember all of it afterward. Memory under that kind of pressure was not reliable. It gave you pieces, moments, the specific words that landed with particular weight and the texture of the room when they landed. She would remember Beaumont's voice, which was measured and unhurried. She would remember that he cited Tessa's account directly, called it remarkable in the specific sense of the word worthy remark, and said that the detail and consistency of a seven-year-old's written account of what she had witnessed was not the kind of evidence a court could set aside in favor of more polished testimony. She would remember that he said the question before him was not whether the current arrangement was recent. The question was whether it was real. He said he found it to be real on the evidence presented. She would remember that he looked at Orson when he said, "The court found no compelling legal claims establishing prior guardianship. The court found the removal of the children from Missouri to not constitute actionable abandonment in the absence of a finalized standing order. Court found the current household to be, by the preponderance of testimony, a stable and functioning environment, meeting the demonstrated needs of the minor children." She would remember the word denied, petition denied, contact with the minor children to require consent of both parents. Both parents, Beaumont said, looking up from the page going forward. She would remember Clement putting his papers together with the brisk efficiency of a man who had lost cleanly and would not perform excessive reaction. Most of its windows were dark. She would remember Orson standing and the look on his face, which was not the smooth pleasantness he had always worn. Underneath that, finally, with nowhere else to go, was what had always been underneath it. Not grief, not real injury, not even anger exactly. Just the flat, cold recognition of a man who had looked at something he wanted and been told no, in terms he could not maneuver around. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. He looked away first. Again, they were outside on the courthouse steps in the afternoon light before Clara could entirely account for the time between the ruling and that moment. Fitch was talking to someone. Dorothea was at the bottom of the steps with Maisie on her hip. Maisie had apparently decided that being on Dorothea's hip was acceptable, which was a social development of some significance. Tessa was beside Clara, standing close, their arms touching. Gideon came down the steps and stopped in front of Clara and said nothing. She looked at him. "It's over." "Yes," he said. She put her arms around him. Just did it, no preamble, no calculation, just stepped forward and put her arms around him, the way you held on to something that had held on to you. And she felt his arms come around her. And she stood on the courthouse steps in Garnet Creek, Wyoming Territory, in May of 1883, and breathed. She was not going to cry. She had made no such rule and would not have enforced it, but it turned out the feeling was too large for crying. Crying was for grief and for relief. And what this was larger than relief. It was something that didn't have a simple word for it. The end of a long, specific fear that had lived in her body, so long she had stopped being able to feel where it ended, and she began. She could feel where it ended now. It ended here. Tessa made a sound beside her, and Clara pulled back from Gideon and looked at her daughter, who was not crying either, because Tessa did not cry in public, and possibly not in private, and whose face had a quality Clara had not seen in it in a very long time. Relief was the wrong word for Tessa, too. It was more like the setting down of something very heavy that she had been carrying for so long the weight had stopped feeling like weight and had started feeling like just how things were. And now it was down and her hands were empty, and she didn't entirely know what to do with empty hands. Clara pulled her in. Tessa's arms came around her waist and held on hard, the grip of someone who'd been told they could let go and was deciding how to do that. "We're going home," Clara said. "I know," Tessa said against her coat. From Dorothea's hip, Maisie had been watching all of this. She watched Clara and Tessa. She watched Gideon, who was standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. And the specific expression he got when he was feeling something he didn't know how to process, externally that inward, contained look that Clara now knew meant the opposite of not feeling. Maisie reached toward him. He looked at her, at the small outstretched hands. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered, without rush, without performance, just looking at what was actually there. He took her from Dorothea. She put her arms around his neck with the wholehearted commitment of a 4-year-old who had made a decision and was not interested in ambiguity. She put her face against his jaw, and she felt him hold her, and everyone on those courthouse steps could see the thing that happened in Gideon Rusk's face in that moment, because it was not the kind of thing a person could manage or contain. He had buried a child in this same ground. He had spent 14 months learning how to be a man who had buried a child, which meant learning a specific terrible geography of grief where you could walk and where you couldn't, what you could touch and what would undo you. He had learned it the way you learn to live with any wound that doesn't fully heal, by going on, by doing the next thing, by not letting the space where something was become the only thing you could see. And now he was standing on a courthouse steps with the 4-year-old's arms around his neck and thought. The 4-year-old weighed almost nothing, and the nothing felt like everything. "Papa," Maisie said, clearly. The way she'd started saying it in the last week, not tentative anymore, not testing, just the word as the plain true thing it was. Gideon closed his eyes. When he opened them, Clara was watching him, and she did not look away. Most of its windows were dark, and whatever was between them in that look was something they had been building towards since December without being able to name it, and they did not need to name it now. Dorothea Crane made a sound that was not a cough and turned to say something to Aldous, who had materialized at some point and was standing beside her, looking, moved in the uncomplicated way of a man who found things moving and didn't try to hide it. They drove home in the late afternoon light, the May sky doing what Wyoming sky did on its better days, enormous and clear and generously lit, the kind of light that made the landscape look like it was explaining itself rather than just existing. Tessa sat in the wagon bed and did not speak for the first hour, which Clara recognized as processing and did not interrupt. Maisie sat with Gideon on the front bench, pressed against his side, the wooden horse in her hand, occasionally pointing at things along the road that seemed significant to her, for reasons she did not always explain. Clara sat beside Gideon on his other side. At some point, without decision, his hand found hers. They drove like that for the last hour, the 4 of them in the wagon, the horse knowing the way home, the light going golden, and then amber, and then the deep clear blue of a May evening in Wyoming. The kind of evening that asked nothing of you. When the ranch came into view, Tessa sat up in the wagon bed. "We won," she said. Not a question. Just confirming what she knew, saying it aloud for the first time since it happened, in the way of someone who needed to hear themselves say a true thing, to be sure it was really true. "Yes," Clara said. Tessa looked at the ranch, at the house that had a bedroom with a lock on the door and a jar of interesting things on the kitchen shelf, and a barn where a horse named Buttercup lived. She looked at it with the expression of someone who was, finally, allowing themselves to see something as theirs. "Okay," she said, and she climbed out of the wagon before it fully stopped, because she was 7 and she had been still for a very long time, and there was no reason to be still anymore. That night, after supper, after Maisie had fallen asleep mid-sentence, telling Gideon something complicated about the wooden horse and its relationship to the brown horse in the barn, which apparently required reconciling, and after Tessa had gone to bed and surprised them both by saying goodnight in a way that included Gideon without ceremony or significant pause, as if it were simply what you did after all of that. Clara and Gideon were in the kitchen in the familiar quiet of their familiar evening. But something was different. The house was different. Not the house was the same wood and glass and winter-sealed windows and jar on the shelf. What was different was the quality of the air in it. The weight of what had followed them was gone. She had been carrying the awareness of Orson for so long, not always actively, but always there, a background frequency of readiness and dread that its absence felt almost physical, like setting a pack down after a very long walk. "I keep waiting to feel differently," she said. Gideon was at the counter. "How? I don't know. I thought when it was over, it would feel more finished." She thought about it. "It does feel finished. I just expected it to feel different than this." "What does it feel like?" she considered. "Ordinary," she said. "It feels ordinary." He turned and looked at her. "That's not bad," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not bad at all." He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table, and they were quiet for a moment the way they had been quiet on 100 evenings since December, except not the same. Nothing was the same, and they both knew it. "I need to tell you something," Gideon said. Clara waited. "When Margaret died," he said, "I thought that was the end of that part of my life. Not just the grief, I mean the part where you have people, where things depend on you." He was looking at the table. "I thought I'd just manage the ranch. That would be enough." He paused. "It was not enough. I knew it wasn't enough, and I was managing that too." Clara said nothing. She let him find it. "And then 3 people came through a blizzard," he said, "and one of them had blue lips. And I didn't think anything particularly, I just did what needed doing." He looked up at her. "I didn't expect it to be this." "What is it?" she said, quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "Everything," he said. "It's everything now. That's what I needed to tell you. I don't have a better word for it than that." Clara looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man who had mentioned the lock first, who had made a wooden horse and walked away from it, who had sold cattle for a lawyer and stood on a courthouse step, holding a 4-year-old who had decided what to call him. She reached across the table and took his hand. They sat like that for a long time, in their kitchen, in their house, while their daughters slept down the hall. There are things worth saying about what came after, not because the story needs them, but because truth needs them. And this is a story about what happens when you decide to tell the truth rather than manage it. Maisie found her voice, that spring the way a river finds its volume after thaw gradually, and then all at once, and then you couldn't remember what the quiet had been like. She talked about everything. About the horses and the grass, and the color of the sky, and what she thought about breakfast and her opinions on P.T.'s hat, which she found troubling. She talked to Dorothea Crane with the fearless particularity of someone who had decided that specific older woman was a person worth telling things to, and Dorothea received it with the brisk warmth of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. Tessa took a longer road, because Tessa always took longer roads and was right to. Did not become a different child. She remained serious and watchful and possessed of opinions she delivered, with a directness that occasionally made adults take a step back. But the vigilance changed its quality. It became slowly less defensive, less the constant readiness of someone expecting the room to change for the worse, and more the natural attentiveness of a person who paid attention, because paying attention was just who she was. She took over the care of Buttercup in June with the same total commitment she brought to everything, and Buttercup, who had been named badly and received the name with the equanimity of a horse that understood some things couldn't be helped, became hers in the way animals become a child's completely, without condition, as a matter of mutual recognition. Clara let herself be happy in the plain, unexamined way that had once felt dangerous. She kept the jar on the shelf. She made bread on Thursdays, and the pantry never ran low, and she learned Gideon's silences, the way you learned a particular landscape where the shade fell, where the light was, what the different textures meant. She stopped locking the bedroom door. Not because she decided to stop. She just realized one morning that she hadn't locked it in 3 weeks and had not noticed. She told Gideon that. He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. She thought about the word and understood that it contained more than its size. Gideon became the father he had not, believed he would have the chance to be, and he did it the same way. He did everything without announcement, through accumulation, through the steady daily work of being present and consistent and honest about what he could and couldn't do. He was not a man who was good at grand gestures. He was a man who was good at showing up, and in the long accounting of a family's life, that was what mattered most. He visited Margaret's grave, less with grief, and more with a quieter kind of conversation. He had not stopped missing her. You didn't stop. But the grief had changed its quality, the way grief did when you let something live alongside it, rather than insisting the living wait until the grief was done. He thought she would have liked them. He was sure of Maisie. He thought Margaret would have found Tessa completely fascinating and somewhat exhausting, which was exactly how Tessa affected most people and was not a disadvantage. He thought she would have liked Clara most of all. Maisie drew one more picture that summer. Clara found it on the kitchen table one morning in July, put there deliberately, waited with a spoon at one corner so it wouldn't blow away in the cross-draft from the open windows. 4 figures, all beneath the same roof, which was rendered in careful lines. 4 walls and a peak and the suggestion of a chimney. The figures were close, not merged, not overlapping, just close, shoulder to shoulder in the way of people who have chosen to be near each other and are not trying to prove anything by it. Above the house, in Maisie's careful, round, 4-year-old handwriting, one word: family. Clara stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the first drawing, the one in February, 3 figures clustered and one outside at the edge of the page, alone in the cold. She thought about the progression she'd laid out on the bed that night and the line connecting the 4th figure to the 3. She thought about how long and careful and honest a road Maisie had traveled to get from that first drawing to this one. She thought that a 4-year-old had understood something that had spent their whole lives trying to articulate, that family was not a thing you were born into, necessarily. It was a thing you made, out of showing up and staying and choosing, every day, to keep choosing. She thought about a woman at a kitchen table in Missouri by a guttering candle, writing a lie that was also a prayer, aiming herself at the only open door she could see. She thought about a door opening in a blizzard. She picked up Maisie's drawing and put it with the others in the bottom of her bag that was no longer packed, because she was no longer a woman who kept her bag packed. She put it there carefully, the way you kept something that deserved to be kept. Then she made breakfast and called her daughters and listened to the sound of people coming out of their rooms in the morning, which was the sound of a house that had people in it who intended to stay. And she thought that of all the things she had built in her life, this was the one she was most proud of. Not because it was easy, because it wasn't. Because it had cost something real from everyone involved, from Tessa's years-too-old watchfulness and Maisie's long silence and Gideon's willingness to crack open a life he'd sealed shut and her own willingness to walk through waste. He blizzard toward a door she didn't know would open. It had cost something real, and it had made something real. And in the end, she thought, standing in her kitchen in the July light, with the smell of coffee and the sound of a 4-year-old explaining something to a 7-year-old down the hall, that was the only kind of thing worth having. Kind you paid for with what you actually were. The kind that knew your name.